Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. The day my world changed forever, the air smelled like smoke and wet earth. My name is Sergio, and what I am about to relate is not a story of heroism or bravery, but a testimony of how war shatters everything in its path, leaving scars that never go away. This story is not to glorify anything, but to remind myself of what I lost. I grew up in a small village in the mountains of a country that seemed to have forgotten peace. For us, war was a distant thing, a shadow on the news that never touched our lives directly. In my early 20s, I dreamed of becoming an engineer. My life revolved around calculus books, walks to the river with my friends, and the laughter of my younger sister Isabel, who always had a joke ready to brighten any day. Everything changed early one morning. Rain had fallen during the night, leaving a fresh smell in the air. I was awakened by screams and a rumbling that shook the walls of our house. My father ran into my room, his face pale and his breathing agitated. He didn't need to say anything. He already knew what was happening. The rebel troops had arrived in our village. The chaos was indescribable. Armed men were bursting into houses, dragging young men out of their homes. Their screams mingled with the cries of women and the creaking of doors being broken down. My mother hugged me tightly, as if she could protect me from the inevitable. My father tried to negotiate with the men, but they beat him mercilessly. At that moment, I understood that there was no escape. They lined us up in the central square, all the young men. I could feel the cold of the mud under my bare feet and the weight of the rifle one man forced me to carry. They gave us a choice: join them or die. The word choice was a mockery. All around us, the corpses of those who had tried to resist reminded us of the consequences of disobedience. I was taken far away, to a makeshift camp in the middle of the jungle. There I learned the true face of war. On the first day, they made us witness an execution to make it clear what awaited us if we tried to escape. I will never forget the look on that man's face. It was not fear on his face, but an overwhelming sadness. At that moment, I understood that war kills not only bodies, but souls as well. Weeks turned into months. I lost track of time. We were trained like animals, forced to shoot at human targets and follow orders without question. The first time I pulled the trigger, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the gun. The man I shot fell to the ground, and although I was told I had done well, I felt nothing akin to pride, just a growing emptiness. Life in the camp was hell. Every night, cries of pain and despair mingled with the distant chirping of crickets. I often thought about my family, whether they would be safe, whether I would ever see them again. But such thoughts were dangerous. Showing weakness was a death sentence. Eventually, I did what was necessary to survive. I became cold, almost mechanical. Each mission we were assigned took me further away from the person I used to be. We were sent to ambush military caravans, to burn villages, to destroy anything that got in our way. I saw things I can never forget. I saw children wielding weapons bigger than themselves, women being treated like war trophies, men begging for their lives. One day, during a failed ambush, tragedy struck me full on. We were attacking a convoy carrying supplies when I heard a familiar scream. My heart stopped as I recognized Isabel's voice. I ran toward the sound, ignoring the bullets whizzing around me. There she was, wounded, trapped between the soldiers and my comrades. I don't know how she had ended up there, but her presence was a condemnation. I tried to reach her, but a man from our side stopped me. He pushed me to the ground and told me not to move. I felt such intense anger that I could hardly breathe. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but I was paralyzed. Isabel looked at me one last time, before it all ended in a deafening roar. That night, as the rain poured down on the camp, I cried for the first time since I had been taken. Not for me, but for her life cut short, for her laughter that I would never hear again. I realized that the war had not only robbed me of my freedom, but also of the people I loved most. By that time, I was forever changed. I no longer cared about surviving. I wanted to escape, even if it meant dying trying. I planned my escape for weeks, watching the patterns of the guards, waiting for the right moment. One night, when the storm was so intense that we could barely see more than a few meters, I took advantage of the confusion and ran. The jungle was relentless. The rain made the ground slippery and the branches hit my face as I ran blindly. I heard gunshots behind me, but I didn't stop. My only goal was to put as much distance as possible between me and them. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally collapsed, I knew I had crossed some kind of border. I was found by a military patrol the next day. At first, they thought I was an enemy, but after hearing my story, they took me to a shelter. There I met other faces scarred by the war, people who, like me, had lost everything. For weeks, I received medical and psychological care, but no amount of care could repair the damage inside me. When I returned to my village, I found a place unrecognizable. The war had devastated it. My house was in ruins, and there was no trace of my family. I asked the few remaining neighbors, but no one knew anything. I was told that many had fled, others had been killed. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces as I realized that I might never know what had happened to them. Today, as I tell this story, I try to make sense of everything I experienced. I am not the same Sergio who dreamed of being an engineer, who laughed with his sister by the river. The war turned me into someone I barely recognize, someone who bears the scars of horror engraved on his soul. War is not glory or victory. It is destruction, pain, and loss. It is the constant reminder of all that you can never get back. It is a monster that devours you from the inside, leaving only fragments of who you used to be. And those fragments, broken and irreparable, are the only thing that remains when the smoke dissipates and silence reigns again. My name is Roberto, and what I am about to relate is not only a memory but an open wound that accompanies me every day. Sometimes I close my eyes and feel the swaying of the water, the roar of the waves, and the biting cold of that night. A journey that began with hope ended up plunging us into the abyss of despair. It all began as an opportunity to escape the monotony. A childhood friend, Ernesto, invited me to join a fishing expedition on the southern coast. Ernesto was a robust man with an infectious laugh and a natural ability to read the sea. The offer was simple, a temporary job on his boat, La Fortuna, where I could earn good money while enjoying the ocean I had always loved. I eagerly accepted. We set sail on a sunny day with clear skies and the wind in our favor. There were 6 of us on board: Ernesto, his nephew Mario, a shy and reserved young man, Cesar and Alvaro, Ernesto's friends and veteran fishermen, and finally Joaquin, a mechanic who had come to make sure everything was running smoothly. La Fortuna was an old but sturdy boat, built to withstand the pounding of the sea. The first week was quiet, even pleasant. I learned how to cast nets, interpret wind signals, and live together in a small space. Ernesto was a born leader, always ready to teach and keep the group's spirits up. We went deeper and deeper into the ocean, chasing the promises of good fishing, but the weather began to change. The blue sky turned gray, and the wind, which used to push us gently, became cold and threatening. The day of the shipwreck began with a storm announced by a sky that seemed to collapse on us. Ernesto decided that we could go ahead, confident that the ship would hold. But as night fell, the sea broke loose with indescribable fury. The waves were liquid walls that pounded us mercilessly, and each onslaught made La Fortuna creak as if it were about to break in two. We worked together to keep the boat afloat. Ernesto's orders were clear, but panic was beginning to gain ground. Water was seeping through every crevice, and although Joaquin tried desperately to repair the damage, it was like trying to plug a sieve. At one point, a gigantic wave slammed the ship sideways, throwing us all to the ground. That's when I heard the final crack. The Fortuna broke apart and everything was thrown into utter chaos. I fell into the icy water, feeling the cold steal my breath. The waves swept over me and the darkness was total. I managed to cling to a piece of driftwood, looking around for the others. Ernesto was shouting, calling our names as he tried to stay afloat. I saw Mario clinging to a tangled net, his eyes full of terror. Cesar and Alvaro had disappeared. The storm quickly scattered us. For hours I struggled to stay afloat, gulping salt water and trying not to succumb to exhaustion. Finally, the storm subsided and the sea calmed, although the sky was still covered with heavy clouds. Dawn revealed the magnitude of our tragedy. Only 4 of us remained: Ernesto, Mario, Joaquin, and myself, each clinging to some remnant of the boat. We gathered as best we could, swimming toward a larger piece of the partially floating hull. Ernesto took the lead as always, making sure we stayed together. But the cold water and lack of food began to take their toll on us. Mario, the youngest, was shivering uncontrollably. his lips blue from hypothermia. Joaquin had a leg wound, probably caused by some fragment of the boat, and was slowly losing blood. The days passed like an endless cycle of hunger, thirst, and despair. We tried to collect rainwater with our hands and ate small fish that we managed to catch with the nets floating around us. Ernesto was doing his best to keep us alive, encouraging us not to lose hope. But each passing day seemed to take us further away from any chance of rescue. On the third day, Joaquin succumbed. His wound had become infected, and although Ernesto tried to clean it with seawater, it was not enough. He died at dawn, his eyes open, staring at an indifferent sky. His body was left in the water, and watching him disappear into the waves was like losing a part of ourselves. Mario was on the verge of collapse. Ernesto tried to console him, but I could see in his eyes that even he was beginning to lose faith. We didn't talk much. Our energies were focused on surviving. In my mind, I went over the memories of my life, the things I hadn't said, the hugs I had left for later. The guilt and regret were as heavy as the hunger that gnawed at me. On the fifth day, Mario stopped responding. Ernesto and I tried to revive him, but we could do nothing. We lost him too, and his death was a devastating blow. Ernesto, who had always been a pillar of strength, began to crumble. He mumbled to himself, and his eyes lost their characteristic sparkle. It was then that something happened that I will never forget. Ernesto, in his desperation, began to talk about sacrifices, about how one of us had to die so that the other could survive. At first I thought he was delirious, but his words became more and more coherent, more and more calculated. I realized that he was seriously considering killing me to increase his own chances of survival. The next night was a silent confrontation. We were both on edge, and each other's every move was watched with suspicion. I didn't sleep. I knew I couldn't trust him. As the sun began to rise, Ernesto lunged at me with a strength I didn't think he had left. We struggled in the water, each clinging to life in desperation. Finally, I managed to push him away from me. I watched him float face down, motionless, and I knew it was over. I was now alone, with the ocean as my only companion. Hunger, thirst, and guilt consumed me, but I clung to life with a tenacity I didn't know I possessed. 2 days later, a merchant ship found me. I barely had the strength to raise my hand and get their attention, but they did. When I awoke in the ship's sickbay, I knew I had survived, but at a cost I will never forget. I have not been back to sea since, nor do I think I ever will. The ocean, once my refuge, became my prison. And though I have tried to move on, the nights still bring with them the roar of the waves, the cold of the water, and the faces of those who did not make it back with me. My name is David, and what I'm about to relate is an episode that marked my life forever. No matter how much time passes, every time I hear the rumble of thunder or see flashing lights on the road, my mind goes back to that night, as if I were trapped in an endless loop of horror and confusion. It was a Friday night, and the exhaustion of the entire week's work was piling up on my shoulders. I had been driving for hours, traversing a dark and winding road in the direction of my brother's house on the outskirts of town. I distinctly remember that the sky was covered with thick, heavy clouds, a harbinger of an impending storm. The car radio was my only companion, playing a mix of news and ambient music that barely registered as I kept my attention on the road. Traffic was moderate, but every so often vehicles would speed by, their lights briefly blinding me in the darkness. At some point in the night, I began to notice that the road seemed emptier. There were miles and miles of desolate asphalt, flanked by dense, dark woods. Despite the quiet, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest, a foreboding that I couldn't explain. Suddenly, fate intervened. A figure came running out of nowhere onto the road, illuminated by my car's headlights. It all happened in fractions of a second. I turned the steering wheel sharply to avoid the impact, but the maneuver was too aggressive. I lost control of the car, which began to skid on the wet pavement. A deafening sound of metal and glass shattering filled the air as the car spun several times before finally coming to a stop against a tree on the side of the road. The first sensation was confusion. I didn't understand what had happened, where I was, or if I was hurt. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the air, mixed with the humidity of the forest. The windshield was shattered, and my body was immobile, as if every muscle had frozen on impact. I felt a warm, sticky thread sliding down my forehead. I realized I was bleeding. After what seemed like hours, I regained the ability to move. I tried to get out of the car, but the door was jammed. Through the broken glass, I could see the silhouette of the figure that had burst onto the road. It was a man, though I could barely make out his features in the gloom. He approached slowly, limping slightly, until he stopped in front of my vehicle. His gaze was penetrating, almost inquisitive, as if he was assessing my condition. Instinctively, I sensed something was wrong. He did not offer to help me, nor did he show any concern for my condition. Instead, he simply stood there, motionless, with an expression that chilled my blood. Finally, he managed to open the driver's door with a sharp tug and help me out. I could barely stand, but he didn't seem interested in my complaints or questions. He pointed toward the woods, motioning for me to follow him. At the time, my mind was clouded with confusion and fear, but something in his demeanor told me I shouldn't trust him. But I didn't have much choice. The car was completely disabled, and my phone had flown out of range during the accident. I decided to follow him, hoping to find help, or at least temporary shelter until I could contact someone. The man led me down a narrow, soggy trail that snaked through the trees. The storm finally broke, and the rain began to fall heavily, drenching us within minutes. The only sound was the crunching of branches under our feet and the incessant drumming of drops on leaves. As we moved forward, I noticed that the man was carrying something in his hand, something I had not seen before, a metal rod that faintly reflected the light of the lightning. My senses sharpened, and adrenaline began to take over. Something was very wrong. His walk, his silence, even his posture gave me signs of danger. It was then that I saw the hut. It was hidden in the trees, barely visible from the road. It didn't look like a cozy shelter, but more like an abandoned place forgotten by time. The man opened the door and gestured for me to enter. Inside, the atmosphere was as cold and dark as outside. There was rickety furniture, a pungent smell that I couldn't identify, and, most disturbing, dark stains on the floor that looked like they had been there for a long time. My instinct was screaming that I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. As time progressed, the man began to behave more erratically. He was asking me strange questions, some of which didn't seem to make sense as he fiddled with the metal bar in his hands. I tried to remain calm, but my mind was on constant alert, looking for a way to escape. Finally, I found an opportunity. While the man was distracted looking for something in one of the cabin's rooms, I took the opportunity to run away. My legs felt like lead, but fear was driving me. I ran toward the road, not looking back, hoping that another driver would pass and be able to help me. The man took off after me, shouting something I didn't understand, but his footsteps were getting closer and closer. That's when I saw the lights. A truck was approaching at full speed. I ran toward the center of the road, waving frantically. The vehicle came to a screeching halt, and the driver quickly got out, asking me what had happened. Before I could answer, the man who had followed me stopped at the edge of the forest, watching us from the shadows. He said nothing, just turned around and disappeared into the trees. The truck driver took me to the nearest hospital where I could finally feel safe. Later, I learned that the police had found the cabin, but not the man. Inside, they discovered rusty tools, ropes, and evidence that it was not the first time someone had been there under similar circumstances. Although I managed to survive, that night left an indelible mark on me. I no longer drive at night and avoid lonely roads whenever I can. The fear of the unknown, of the dark, and of that man's face still haunts me. Although he was never found again, I know he is out there, somewhere, waiting for his next victim. I can't pinpoint when it all started because some things just become part of you before you know it. For years, I led a life that many would consider normal. A decent job, a house in the suburbs, and a routine so stable that it was even monotonous. But underneath that quiet facade was something no one else knew about. Something that I carried with me every day, like a shadow that never went away. It all started one winter night, more than a decade ago. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, with a head full of ideas and an ego fueled by the sense of invincibility that only youth can give you. We had gone out to celebrate with some friends, a group of guys with whom I shared more drinks than deep conversations. That night, we drank too much, and in our euphoria, we decided to drive to a nearby lookout point, an isolated place where we used to go to scream into the void and feel free. I was the one driving. I shouldn't have done it, but at the time, the consequences seemed far away and unlikely. I remember we were laughing, singing at the top of our lungs until a figure appeared on the road. It was a matter of seconds. A thud, A screech of brakes, and then a silence that seemed to stretch on for ages. When I got out of the car, I saw him, a middle-aged man lying on the asphalt. He wasn't moving. I didn't know what to do. My friends shouted that we should leave, that no one had seen us, that there was no point in ruining our lives over an accident. In my state of confusion and fear, I listened to them. We got in the car and drove away, leaving the man there as if by leaving him, we could escape the guilt as well. There was no news the next day or the next, but my life changed from that moment on. At first, I constantly hoped that someone would knock on my door, that the police would find out what we had done. But the days passed, and the world kept turning. But inside me, something had broken. I tried to move on, to build a life. I moved out of town, stopped talking to the friends who were with me that night, and buried the memory of what happened as deeply as I could. It worked, at least for a while. But the weight of that night was always there, like a knife that you get used to but never stops hurting. Years later, I met Carla. She was everything I didn't deserve. Smart, kind, with a smile that could light up any room. I fell in love with her almost immediately, although I also knew from the beginning that I could never tell her what I had done. How do you explain something like that to the person you love? We got married, and our life together was everything I could have dreamed of. But even in the happiest moments, there was a dark corner in my mind that I could never ignore. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night sweating with the echoing thump in my ears. Other times I would see the man's face in my dreams, looking at me with accusing eyes. There were nights when I would get up to check windows or doors, convinced that someone was out there watching, waiting. Carla noticed my behaviors but never asked too many questions. She would say I was a reserved man and respected my space, although her eyes sometimes showed concern. She tried to justify my anxiety attacks by telling me it was normal to bring home stress from work, but I knew it was more than that. It was guilt, a poison that seeped into every corner of my life. One day, when I had been married to Carla for almost 10 years, I received a letter. It had no return address, just my name written in clumsy letters. When I opened it, I found a note that read, "I know what you did. See you tomorrow at 7 p.m. at the corner cafe." My world came crashing down. My world came crashing down. Who could have known? I had been careful. I had closed all doors to the past. For hours, I paced the house like a ghost, trying to decide what to do. In the end, curiosity and fear drove me to the cafe. When I arrived, an older man was waiting for me at a table in the corner. He had a face marked by deep wrinkles and dark eyes that seemed to pierce your soul. Without a word, he slid a photograph across the table. It was of the man he had run over, and behind him, there was a small boy, probably his son. The man told me that he had spent years looking for the man responsible, and now, finally, he had found me. He didn't ask for money or justice. All he wanted was a confession. He said that if I didn't, he would take it upon himself to expose me to the world. For days, I struggled with the decision. The thought of confessing everything terrified me. I would lose Carla, my job, my whole life. But I couldn't go on living with the constant threat of being found out. Finally, I decided to do it. I wrote a letter explaining everything, including how I had been a coward to run away that night. I delivered it to the local police station, accompanied by a lawyer. When I was arrested, I felt a strange relief, as if I could finally breathe after years of holding my breath. But this is where the story takes its unexpected turn. During the trial, as I recounted my version of events, something I never imagined was revealed. The man who claimed to be the victim's son was not who he said he was. He was, in fact, a journalist obsessed with a cold case who had fabricated the connection to the man who had been run over in order to pressure me into confessing. Worse, the police discovered that the man I had hit that night had not died in the accident. He had survived, albeit with serious injuries, and had died years later of unrelated causes. There was never a real investigation because he himself had said he did not remember who had hit him. I was convicted of leaving the scene, but the sentence was minimal. I was released from prison months later with a freedom that now weighed more heavily on me than ever. Not only had I run away that night, but I had let my guilt destroy my life for years. When I returned home, Carla was gone. She had left when she learned the truth. My life, built on lies and omissions, had completely fallen apart. Today I live alone, in a small gray apartment. I work at something that barely gives me enough to live on, and I spend my nights thinking about all that could have been. My greatest punishment is not the law or the time I spent behind bars. It's knowing that the man I was that night still lives inside me, and that I can never escape him. Every day I wonder if I could have done something different, if I would have had the courage to face the consequences instead of building a life on a rotten foundation. And in the quietest nights, when the world seems to stand still, I can still hear the loud thump on the road and the whisper of my own fears. I know what you did. What? My name is Martin, and if someone had told me years ago that I would end up talking about this, I probably would have laughed. Now, sitting in front of my desk in a locked room with paranoia still lurking in the darkest corners of my mind, I know this is not a story to laugh about. This is the story of how I almost lost everything, my identity, my life and my freedom, at the hands of a group hiding behind the facade of a supposed path to enlightenment. It all started when I was going through one of the lowest moments of my life. My relationship of years had ended abruptly. I had lost my mother a few months earlier, and my work as a freelance photographer was barely keeping me afloat. I was searching for answers, for something to make sense of all the chaos. That's when a friend, Abraham, told me about a spiritual retreat that had just changed his life. He described it as a space to find peace and purpose, led by a man they only called the Guide. At first I was skeptical, but Abraham insisted. He told me that after the retreat he had found clarity, purpose, and a family in the group. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I finally agreed to accompany him to the next meeting. In retrospect, that was the first step into an abyss I never saw coming. The retreat was held on a remote farm deep in a dense and silent forest. The place had an eerie air about it, but everyone in attendance seemed warm and welcoming. We were greeted with smiles and kind words. Dixon, the coordinator, was in charge of overseeing the activities and making sure we were all comfortable. I felt relieved at first, as if I had found a place where I could leave my worries behind. The first day was simple: breathing exercises, talks about spiritual connection, and group dynamics to share our emotions. Everyone seemed open and vulnerable, something that initially struck me as genuine. At the end of the day, we gathered around a campfire while the guide spoke. He was a middle-aged man with a magnetic presence. His words were powerful, and his penetrating gaze seemed to pierce through any barrier one might try to put up. His speech centered on the idea that modern society was broken, that we were all tainted by ego, and that the only way to find true freedom was to give ourselves completely to the community. At first, what he was saying made sense. He was talking about letting go of the burdens of the past, building a more just world, and finding a collective purpose. But I soon noticed that there was an underlying tone that didn't quite fit. He emphasized the need for purification, a process that, he said, required stripping away everything that defined us as individuals. Our possessions, our external relationships, and above all, our internal resistance. On the third day, the most intense activities began. We were divided into small groups, and each had a mentor who supervised our tasks. I was assigned to Joshua, a man who seemed kind but quickly became overbearing. He subjected us to long sessions of group confessions, where we had to reveal our deepest fears and mistakes. He said it was part of the liberation process, but I felt that something was wrong when the confessions of some of our companions were then used as examples of what we should not be. The pressure increased when they started to reduce our sleeping hours and the amount of food. They said that hunger and tiredness were ways to break down our internal barriers. I remember one night in particular, when they made us walk barefoot through the forest in complete darkness, guided only by our mentor's instructions. At first I thought it was an exercise in trust, but I soon realized that it was an act of submission. My friendship with Abraham began to deteriorate. He seemed completely devoted to the group, defending each of their practices as necessary for our transformation. Whenever he expressed doubts, he would tell me it was my ego resisting change. I felt I was losing him, that he was no longer the same person I knew. The breaking point came during the last night of the retreat. We were taken to a clearing in the forest where the guide waited for us surrounded by torches. He said it was time to take the final step towards enlightenment, which required an act of total surrender. He asked us to sign a document that he said was a symbolic pact to leave our old lives behind. At that moment, my instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. I tried to refuse, but Dixon and Joshua approached, their smiles gone, replaced by stern looks. They told me it was normal to be afraid, that resistance was part of the process, but that I should trust them. When I refused again, their tone changed. They warned me that I would not break with the group without consequences, The words were veiled, but the threat was clear. That night, while the others slept, I made the decision to escape. I knew I could not stay there any longer. I waited until all was quiet and left the cabin. I walked through the forest, guided by the faint moonlight. My heart was pounding, and every creak of the branches under my feet made me fear that someone was following me. I made it to the main road at dawn. A car stopped, and the driver, seeing me soaked and exhausted, agreed to take me to the nearest town. The next day I went straight to the police. At first they doubted my story, but after investigating they discovered that the group had a dark history. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to escape from them. Abraham never returned my calls. The following months were a struggle to get my life back, to leave behind the psychological manipulation and constant fear. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had signed that document, if I had completely given in to his control. I know now that the real terror is not in the supernatural, but in the ability of humans to destroy others in the name of a cause. My name is Richard, and if I could turn back time, I would do it without hesitation. What I'm about to tell you is a wound that will never heal, a memory that haunts me every time I close my eyes. It all started 3 years ago, one afternoon when what seemed to be a normal day ended up marking my life forever. It was a hot Saturday, and I was heading to the mountains for a hike. I had discovered my passion for hiking after a car accident from which I emerged unscathed, but which made me rethink many things. The fresh air, open landscapes, and disconnection from the hustle and bustle of the city offered me a kind of therapy. That day I chose an off-the-beaten path, a trail that meandered along the edge of a cliff with spectacular views. Although I was used to walking alone, I made sure to carry my phone, plenty of water, and a basic first aid kit. Little did I know that all of that would be insufficient. When I reached the trailhead, the place was deserted. The few times I had been there, I'd always come across hikers, but that day was different. Despite the loneliness, I continued on my way. I walked deeper into the forest, enjoying the birds singing and the crunching of the leaves under my boots. All seemed calm until I heard a scream. It was a muffled, desperate sound coming from the direction of the cliff. My body reacted before my mind could process what I had heard. I ran to the edge of the cliff, my heart pounding. As I reached it, I saw a man hanging from a branch overhanging the cliff. His fingers were clutching desperately, and his face was covered with sweat and dust. He was screaming, calling for help, while his feet searched for a support that did not exist. I knew in that instant that I could not leave him there. I looked around for something I could use to help him, but the ground was clear except for some rocks and bushes. I knelt down on the edge and reached out my hand to him. The branch holding him creaked with every movement, threatening to break at any moment. I asked him to try to climb up, to use his legs to propel himself as I pulled him up. The man, whom I later learned was named Manuel, was heavier than I imagined. As I pulled him up, I felt my muscles protest. His hand slipped, and for an instant I thought I would lose it, but he managed to grab hold again. The branch creaked again, and my desperation grew. Every second that passed was a struggle against time. My hands began to sweat, and Manuel's weight carried me dangerously close to the edge. The ground was unstable, and my body trembled with effort. I tried to anchor myself to a nearby rock with my feet, but I didn't have enough support. I felt his strength begin to give way. His face reflected the terror of someone who saw his end approaching. His gaze met mine, and in that instant I knew it would not be enough to try. I needed something more to save him. I told him to hold on while I searched for a solution. I ran back to the trail, where I remembered seeing an abandoned rope next to a wooden post. I picked it up and ran back to the cliff, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. But when I arrived, the scene I encountered paralyzed me. Manuel was no longer there. His scream echoed in my ears before absolute silence blanketed everything. I peered over the edge and saw his motionless body at the bottom of the ravine, surrounded by rocks and bushes. An inexplicable chill ran through my body. My chest rose and fell violently, and tears began to flow uncontrollably. I stood there for a few minutes, motionless, processing what had just happened. My mind filled with if only I had reacted faster, if only I had had more strength, if only I hadn't gone alone that day. But none of that mattered. Manuel was dead, and I couldn't save him. I decided to go down to the bottom of the ravine to make sure there was no hope left, even though I knew it was useless. The descent was complicated and dangerous. I scraped my hands and legs as I tried to keep my balance on the loose rocks. When I finally arrived, I saw his body up close. His face was serene, as if the fear had disappeared at the last instant. I felt a mixture of sadness and guilt so deep I could barely breathe. I took out my phone and called the emergency services. I gave them the approximate coordinates and waited by Manuel's body, unable to leave him alone. Time passed slowly and every minute was torture. When the rescuers arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words got stuck. They looked at me with a mixture of compassion and professionalism, taking note of everything as they went about their work. Getting home that night was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. The road was shrouded in a darkness that seemed all-consuming, and my mind kept replaying the moment when their hands slipped from mine. I didn't sleep that night or the next few nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face and felt the emptiness of not having been able to do more. Over time, I found out more about Manuel. He was a middle-aged man married with 2 small children. He had gone for a walk that day after an argument with his wife, looking for some peace in nature. Knowing that only made my guilt grow. I imagined his family, waiting for his return, and the pain they must have felt when they learned what had happened. I tried to find solace in the idea that I did the best I could, but the truth is, it wasn't enough. Every time I return to the mountain, I carry the weight of that day with me as a constant reminder of the fragility of life and how easy it is to lose everything in an instant. This experience changed my perspective forever. No matter how hard I try, I will never be able to erase the memory of that failed rescue, nor Manuel's face in his final moments. But what I can do is tell this story, in the hope that it will inspire others to be more prepared, more attentive, and above all, more aware of the responsibility we have towards others. Rain has always given me a sense of comfort. The serenity of the falling drops, the dull sound of the torrential rains pattering on the roof of my apartment, allowed me to disconnect from the outside world. But that day, the rain, far from being a calm, became the harbinger of a terrifying turn in my life. Little did I know that storm would break loose in my office, or that the man I had known as a simple co-worker, someone with whom I shared harmless chats about the weather and everyday life, was going to become the shadow that would mark every corner of my existence. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I met Nicholas. I had started working at the marketing agency just a few months ago, a professional but relaxed environment, with colleagues who quickly became friends. Nicholas was one of those new employees with an air of mystery who presented himself as a quiet but friendly person. He was always willing to help, and although his gaze was intense, no one suspected that there was something more beneath his apparent friendliness. The rain had begun to fall heavily that afternoon. The drops were crashing against the office windows, creating a monotonous rhythm that contrasted with the hustle and bustle of work. That afternoon, I was reviewing some reports when Nicholas approached my desk. There was something about the way he moved, the way he approached me, that made me feel a slight shiver, but I attributed it to the awkwardness one sometimes feels with new colleagues. He offered me a friendly smile and made a comment about the reports he was reviewing, suggesting that it would be helpful to add some additional data. At first, it all seemed harmless, even helpful. But as the days went by, Nicholas began to show up more often, always with something to say about my work, about how I managed it, about my way of organizing myself. The first few times, I tried not to make a big deal out of it, thinking he just wanted to be friendly or helpful. But that friendliness started to become annoying. Every time I left my office to take a break or go to the bathroom, he was nearby, watching. And every time we passed each other, his comments became more personal. One afternoon, while we were in the office lunchroom, Nicholas mentioned something about my personal life, something I had never told him. A simple comment that suggested he knew more than was normal. At first, it puzzled me, but I took it as a coincidence. However, it soon became routine. He would show up at the most unexpected times, talking to me about my private life with a knowledge he shouldn't have. One evening, after a long workday, I headed for the parking lot to go home. The rain was pouring down, blurring the view and creating puddles all over the place. When I got to the car, I felt someone watching me. As I turned around, there was Nicholas, standing under the light of a street lamp, staring. His expression was blank, almost emotionless. He only told me that it had been a pleasure working together that day, but there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. The way he looked at me, as if he was analyzing me, left me with a strange feeling that I couldn't get out of my mind. That night I didn't sleep well. Anxiety began to take hold of me. Every time I thought about him, something inside me told me that he was not just a companion, but someone with dark intentions. Days passed, and Nicholas began to follow me, without me being able to help it. He would arrive at work before me, he would stay late, always at times when I thought he wouldn't see me. I could no longer concentrate on my work. I could not rest without his figure appearing in my thoughts. Everything began to feel like a power play, and I, unable to escape his eyes, felt caught in his web. The jokes of yesteryear turned into merciless criticisms of my every move. If I forgot a task, he would point it out in public, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His words became aggressive, though they never seemed so. His presence made me uncomfortable, fearful, and that discomfort began to affect me so much that my performance at work dropped drastically. I felt like I couldn't do anything right, and everything seemed to revolve around his constant surveillance. Sometimes I thought he was watching me from the shadows, that everything he did was to provoke me, to make me feel small and vulnerable. One day, as I was about to leave work, Nicholas appeared at my desk. This time his behavior had crossed a line. He told me that I should think carefully about what I would do if I didn't collaborate with him. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but the tone in his voice left no room for doubt. That veiled threat chilled my heart. I felt my whole body tense up, but I couldn't react. I couldn't just ask for help, because no one would believe me. Nicholas was the kind of person who knew how to manipulate people with his calm smile and soft words. No one would believe he could be dangerous. The situation escalated quickly. Nicholas started showing up in places he shouldn't be. I would see him in the lobby of my building, outside the supermarket, even near my house. Every moment, fear and paranoia took over me. I was aware that I could no longer live like this. I couldn't bear to be constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he was around, if he was following me. One afternoon, after a particularly tense week, I decided to talk to building security. I explained what was going on, even though I knew it would be hard to believe. Fortunately, the security personnel listened to me. Apparently, Nicholas had engaged in strange behavior with other coworkers before, although no serious action had been taken. The security guard informed me that they would alert the police if they saw him near the facility. The next day, as I drove to work in the pouring rain, I saw Nicholas standing in front of the building. There was something else in his attitude, something completely different. I felt vulnerable, but this time I was not alone. The police had been alerted, and as soon as Nicholas saw me, he came over to give me one of his usual comments about my attitude. This time, however, the officers stopped him. He made no resistance, but on his face was a cold, calculating smile, as if he knew he was about to lose the control he had had over me. Nicholas's arrest was a relief to me, but the feeling of being watched never completely dissipated. Although I had managed to escape his constant pursuit, the damage had been done. It was weeks before I was able to return to normalcy at work. Fear, anxiety, and stress stayed with me for a long time. And although Nicolas was out of my life, the emotional scars he left lingered. Eventually, I learned that Nicholas had a history of violent behavior. A dangerous man with a knack for manipulating and controlling those around him, and who did not hesitate to make my life a living hell. Fortunately, it all ended when the police managed to arrest him before he could do me any more harm. But in my mind, the shadows of that rainstorm never completely faded away. My name is Carlos, and although I never imagined it, my life changed radically one night that on the surface seemed no different from any other. I am an ordinary man, with no great aspirations or emotionally complex life. I worked in an office, and my days were spent between papers, emails, and superficial conversations. I didn't like surprises, so I made sure my routine was as stable as possible. Living in a small town where everyone seemed to know each other gave me a sense of security that I never imagined I would lose. One September afternoon, when the sky was gray and the first rains were falling heavily on the asphalt, I was heading back to my apartment after a long day at work. As usual, I took the bus and got off at the same station as always, a few blocks from my home. The wind was cool, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was walking down the street thinking about what I would have to do the next day when something caught my eye. On the corner, near a small park, a man was sitting on a bench. His presence was unusual, although at first I didn't understand why. He was not a particularly striking man, but his posture struck me as odd. He looked nervous, fidgety, and was constantly looking sideways, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Despite my indifferent nature, something about his attitude struck me as disconcerting, and I couldn't help but look at him more closely. But I ignored him and continued walking toward my apartment. In the distance, I saw a couple of children playing in the rain and some couples walking along the sidewalk, ignoring the weather that was starting to get stormier. When I reached my building, I was relieved. It seemed like a normal night, but at the same time, something was in the air that I could not identify. As I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I began to wonder why I had noticed the man in the corner so much. Maybe, just maybe, he was more tired than I thought. That night I kept tossing and turning in bed. My mind was restless, something that never used to happen. Like some kind of omen, something told me that the calm before the storm was just that. Calm. Finally, I fell into a deep sleep. But my nightmares soon began. I awoke startled in the middle of the night, my body drenched in sweat. The sense of dread was palpable, though I couldn't identify its source. A noise at the door brought me out of my thoughts. At first, I thought it was the rain pounding on the windows, but it wasn't raining. The sound was repeated, this time louder. My heart began to beat rapidly. I slowly got out of bed and approached the hallway, trying to listen for any noise that might give me a clue. Nothing. But my intuition told me something wasn't right. Just then, the door to my apartment burst open. It was completely dark, but I could make out several silhouettes on the other side of the entrance. My body froze. 5 men entered without a word. They were tall, dressed in dark clothes, and moved with a precision that made me think they had practiced this many times before. None of them seemed surprised by my reaction. My throat closed, but I couldn't make a sound. They pushed me back and forced me into the bathroom, where they held my arms. I can say that, at that moment, my mind went into a state of denial. I thought it was a dream, that something could not be real. However, the pain in my wrists and the coldness of the room reminded me that what I was experiencing was more terrifying than any nightmare. One of the men, the one who seemed to be the leader, began to speak to me calmly, but his words made no sense to me. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I was completely at their mercy, not knowing what they wanted or why they were there. After a few minutes, they made me walk to the door, where they pushed me out of my own home and into a dark vehicle. There was nothing I could do to stop them. In fact, I was not even offered the opportunity to speak. The ride in the vehicle was long and silent, and although the city seemed unchanged, I felt like I was moving away from everything I knew. The men did not speak to each other, and I did not dare to break the silence. A sense of helplessness filled me with palpable anxiety, and my thoughts were mixed with a visceral fear. What did they want from me? Where were they taking me? The car stopped in front of a dilapidated building in a completely isolated area. I didn't know what to expect, but the place looked like an abandoned prison to me. I was dragged into the building where the concrete walls seemed to watch me with a cold and cruel indifference. Inside, the men left me in an empty room, closing the door with a dull thud. I was alone, all alone, not knowing what would happen next. Hours passed, maybe more, but time was becoming irrelevant in that darkness. My mind was beginning to fray, wondering if it would be the last day of my life. Despair began to take hold of me. In the gloom, I began to hear voices. I was not alone. I got up and approached the door. My mind was racing a mile a minute, trying to decipher if there was any chance of escape, fight, or even survival. The door opened with a metallic creak. Again, the men entered, and this time one of them, the one who appeared to be the youngest, stared at me. There seemed to be something in his gaze that could not be ignored, something I could not understand. But what happened next left me completely bewildered. Instead of what I expected, the men began to talk among themselves. The leader of them seemed to be discussing something with the others, and for a moment, I got the feeling that he was deliberating something important. What did they want with me? Why all this? The guy watching me told me to keep still. Instead of hitting me or threatening me, they offered me a deal, a negotiation. It wasn't what I had hoped for, but my fear wouldn't let me turn it down. The boy explained to me that they had been following the wrong person. The truth, it seemed, was that the man they wanted was not me, but another man named Eduardo, an acquaintance of one of them. I was relieved, but also completely confused. What was going on? I didn't understand how they had made such a serious mistake. Why me? However, they left me alone for a couple of days until a police officer appeared on the scene. The police managed to track down the kidnappers thanks to an anonymous tip that one of the men had made by accident. It turned out that the group was an organized gang, but what struck me most was that one of the members, the leader, was related to someone close to me, someone who, as I was later to discover, had been part of a rivalry between families. Eduardo, the man for whom I had been kidnapped, was involved in a much bigger affair than I had imagined. The men were arrested and the truth came out. Even today, I can't help but wonder how I got caught up in a war that had nothing to do with me. My normal days had become a living hell, and although I was released, the feeling of being trapped, of having no control over what happened to me, never went away. What happened that night changed my life irreparably. Not only because I almost lost my life, but because I will never look around me the same way again. The fear, although now more manageable, remains, and I will never stop wondering who could be watching me. My name is Ezekiel, and this is the story I never wanted to tell, but that haunts me every day of my life. It all began on a hot September afternoon, one of those that seemed to suffocate not only the body but also the soul. My younger brother Jorge and I had planned to meet after work for dinner. It wasn't something extraordinary. We had done it often since we were kids. But that day, that simple routine, became the beginning of my worst nightmare. Jorge and I were always very close. Although we were different in almost every way, we had a special connection, the kind that only brothers understand. He was the dreamer, the charismatic one, the one who always saw the best in people. I, on the other hand, was the practical one, the one who analyzed things with skepticism. Despite our differences, we were inseparable. That afternoon, when I received his message confirming that we would arrive at the same restaurant as always, I could not have imagined that it would be the last time I would hear his voice. I arrived before him, as I usually did. I ordered a beer and sat near a window watching the bustle of the street. I looked at the clock every now and then, but I wasn't worried. Jorge was usually a little late. It was part of his carefree personality. After half an hour, I began to worry. I sent him a message, but he didn't answer. I tried to call him, but the tone kept ringing over and over again with no answer. Something inside me began to scream that something wasn't right. I decided to leave the restaurant and walk to his apartment, which was a few blocks away. As I walked, the feeling that something terrible had happened intensified. My mind tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe his battery had run out. Maybe he had decided to stop somewhere else before arriving. But every step I took seemed heavier, as if an invisible force was trying to stop me. As I turned the corner of his street, I saw a scene that still haunts me. There was a crowd gathered in front of the building where Jorge lived. Lights from police cars and ambulances illuminated the night, painting everything with a blue and red hue that looked like something out of a nightmare. I picked up my pace, pushing past people to get closer, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. When I made it all the way to the entrance, an officer stopped me. I told him I was looking for my brother, who lived there. His look, serious and charged with compassion, confirmed what I feared before I could utter a word. Jorge was dead. He had been found in his apartment, the victim of a brutal attack. According to the police, someone had broken into his home, and although they still had no clear motive, everything pointed to a robbery gone wrong. My mind refused to process it. How was that possible? I had spoken to him just hours before. He was full of life, full of dreams, and now, all of that had been snatched away in an instant. That night, as I waited in place to give a statement, it felt like time stood still. Every second seemed like an endless martyrdom. I remembered all the times Jorge and I had talked about our plans, our dreams. I remembered his laugh, his way of seeing the world with a light that I had always admired. And now, all that had vanished, left behind in a room stained with violence. The days that followed were a storm of emotions. The police called me constantly to ask if Jorge had any enemies, if he had mentioned anything strange in the last few weeks. The truth is that I couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm him. Jorge was loved by everyone, one of those people who seemed to have no enemies. But the more they investigated, the more it seemed that his death had not been a simple robbery. Something didn't add up, and the uncertainty only increased my pain. One night, going through some of his things in his apartment, I found something that changed everything. Among her papers, there was a series of printed messages from an email that I didn't recognize. They were threatening, full of hate. The person who had sent them accused Jorge of something I could not understand, something related to his work. Jorge was an architect, worked on community projects, and was always focused on helping others. How could anyone hate him for that? I took the emails to the police, but their responses only added more questions. They discovered that the email address was a fake, an account created just to send those messages. However, they did manage to trace some details that pointed to a dispute with a client of one of Jorge's projects. Apparently, he had had problems with a man who disagreed with the construction of a community center in his neighborhood. The man, whose name was Ricardo, had been particularly vocal in his opposition, but we had never imagined he was capable of anything so extreme. The police began investigating Ricardo, but they had insufficient evidence to charge him. Meanwhile, I could not get out of my head the idea that this person, this stranger who had filled Jorge with hatred, could be free, living his life without remorse. My rage grew with each passing day without answers. I could not sleep. I could not eat. My life had been reduced to a single purpose: to find justice for my brother. A month later, the police arrested Ricardo. They had found evidence linking him directly to the crime scene. I remember the call I received from one of the detectives. They told me that they had found fingerprints and that Ricardo had confessed, although he showed no remorse. He said he had done it in a fit of anger, that he felt Jorge had humiliated him by not listening to his complaints. When the trial came, I attended every session. I looked Ricardo in the eyes, searching for something, any sign of humanity, of remorse. But I found nothing, only an emptiness, an absence of empathy that chilled my blood. He was sentenced to prison, but even when I heard the verdict, I felt no relief. Jorge was still dead. Nothing would change that. Today, I still struggle to find peace. Jorge's death left a void that I will never be able to fill. But it also left me something else. A brutal lesson about the fragility of life, about how an instant can change everything. Every day, I try to honor his memory, to live the way he did, with love, with hope, with the same light he always carried with him. But there are nights when it all comes back, when I close my eyes and relive that moment in front of the building, that feeling of helplessness that consumes me. And even though I know I can't change what happened, I cling to the memories of Jorge, to his laughter, to his spirit. Because as long as I remember him, as long as I keep his story alive, he will never be completely lost. One rainy afternoon in December, as the drops fell relentlessly on the city's sodden streets, I found myself trapped in my usual routine. I live in a neighborhood far from downtown, a quiet place, but always with that feeling of isolation that makes me think that time moves forward without me really noticing it. I'm Martin, and like every day, I was returning home after a long shift at the office. The sound of the wind and rain accompanied me as I walked along the sidewalk alone. The other passers-by seemed to be hurried shadows, taking cover from the water under their umbrellas. It was already late afternoon, and the city was shrouded in a heavy silence, as if the storm was absorbing any noise that might come out of the daily routine. When I arrived at my building, I was not surprised to find the hall empty. Most of my neighbors were usually home at that hour, but the storm kept them inside. I wasn't surprised either that the elevator was out of service. I walked up the stairs, listening to the rain pattering against the hallway windows. The sense of isolation was palpable. That night, something changed. It hadn't been a particularly hectic day, but as I was getting ready for dinner, an uncomfortable feeling began to creep over me. I felt as if someone was watching me, though I couldn't put a face to it. I closed the living room curtains, but the feeling persisted. I forced myself to concentrate on the television, trying to drown out the thought that was eating away at me. I thought maybe it was just tiredness or that the rain had left a bad taste in my mouth. But the restlessness grew, like a lurking shadow. It was close to midnight when the noise at the door brought me out of my thoughts. A slow, almost meticulous knocking. I froze, my heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at that hour with the storm outside? My first impulse was to ignore the sound, but something told me I shouldn't. I got up slowly, approaching the door cautiously. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a figure standing in the hallway. I didn't recognize his face, but he was a tall man dressed in a long coat. Despite the rain, he did not appear to be wet. His presence was strange to me, as if he didn't fit into that environment. I tried not to make a sound as I watched. He just stood there, not moving, looking down at the ground. I felt uncomfortable, but I couldn't help but wonder what he would do in that situation. After a few moments that felt eternal, I decided to open the door, perhaps on an inexplicable impulse. The figure raised his head as soon as I did, and the first thing I noticed was his fixed, almost penetrating gaze. I don't quite remember what happened next. The next memory I have is of being inside a car, the man's face very close to mine, his eyes cold and empty. A lump formed in my throat, and the feeling of dread completely paralyzed me. I didn't understand how I had gotten there. I tried to speak, but my voice was trapped in my chest. The car was driving along deserted streets, moving farther and farther away from my home. Time in the vehicle seemed to stand still. The storm was still pounding the glass hard, and the light from the headlights was the only thing illuminating the shadows that formed around us. When I was given a chance to speak, it was not words that came out of my mouth, but a couple of nervous, shaky sighs. The man, undeterred, motioned for me to remain silent. My mind was spinning, searching for some logical explanation for what was happening. But logic had no place in this situation. In the distance, I saw the silhouette of a dilapidated building, an old abandoned factory that no longer produced anything but desolation. It made me think of worst-case scenarios, stories of kidnappings and disappearances. The car stopped in front of the entrance, and the men who had been silent all the way now surrounded me, pushing me out of the vehicle. I was completely surrounded. Despite my confusion, terror filled me. The men didn't speak, just dragged me into the building, where the damp, stagnant air hit me like a cold wave. My mind could no longer think clearly, but everything inside me told me I had to resist. However, every attempt to escape was futile. In the end, I was left in an empty room where the darkness seemed to engulf everything. For hours, nothing happened. Fear and uncertainty kept me alert, but there was no sign that my captors were nearby. Time became a constant torture. I thought about my family, my friends, and everything I might lose. The worst was the feeling of not knowing why I was there, or who these men were. Panic flooded me, but also a strange sense of acceptance, as if my fate was already written. When the door opened, one of the men appeared. He looked me up and down with a blank expression, but said nothing. For a moment, I thought all was lost, that I would never return to my former life. But something in his eyes changed, something I could not identify. It was then that I understood that there was something bigger behind it all. The man had not come alone. There was someone else with him, someone who seemed to be calling the shots. I was dragged through the corridors, into a more brightly lit room, where I saw the person behind it all. It was not an unfamiliar face. I knew this person, although I didn't know in what context. It was a former colleague from the university, Samuel, a man who had disappeared months ago. Samuel did not seem the same. He was different, colder, more calculating. He didn't recognize me right away, and his attitude only increased my despair. What happened next was even more confusing. Samuel had been involved in a dangerous business, he explained to me, although I didn't get a chance to know the details. The men with him were working for him, and he had wanted revenge for something that had happened in the past. For some reason, I had been chosen as a victim in his plan, but the game had changed for him. Samuel's plans went awry when one of his accomplices betrayed him. In the end, against all odds, Samuel and his group were arrested thanks to information provided to the police by an anonymous witness. That night, while I was being held captive, the witness had managed to track the gang's whereabouts and tip off the authorities. The men were arrested on the spot, and the nightmare ended for me. I was released, but not without after effects. The rain, which had accompanied my kidnapping, continued to fall during the following days, as a metaphor for my emotional state. I felt scarred by all that I had lived through, by the constant fear of not knowing when the nightmare might return. Although I was fortunate to get out alive, the experience changed me forever. The shadow of uncertainty would always remain, reminding me that at any moment normality can become as ephemeral as rain on a dark night. It all began with an imperceptible change in the routine of the building, a slight crack in the serenity that for years had defined that place. The complex where I lived was not particularly remarkable. A small, somewhat old-fashioned building with thin walls and neighbors who had been there so long that we knew each other's habits almost like a shared ritual. There were no big surprises in our lives until the new tenant arrived in apartment 4B. He was a nondescript-looking man, middle-aged, thin, and with curly hair. His arrival was almost stealthy. He brought his belongings in the night, carrying boxes with quick movements, as if he wanted to avoid being seen. He greeted no one, exchanged no words or glances with the few neighbors who were still awake. There was something about his behavior that from the beginning made me uneasy, although I could not explain exactly what it was. The first few weeks passed without incident. I hardly saw him. We never met in the hallway, and if I heard any noise from his apartment, it was muffled and sporadic. Perhaps I was too used to the quiet routine of the building, because this almost total absence of activity began to seem strange to me. It was one night while I was trying to sleep that everything began to change. I heard a constant rhythmic sound coming from apartment 4B. It was a dry, repetitive tapping sound. At first I thought I was repairing something or moving furniture, but the noise continued for hours. I got out of bed and moved closer to the wall to listen better. The pounding had a mechanical, almost obsessive rhythm, as if someone was hammering wood with a metal object. The next morning I tried not to make a big deal of it. I figured anyone could have a noisy night, but that same night the knocking returned, but this time accompanied by a new sound, a heavy creaking, as if something large was being dragged across the floor. I felt the urge to go out and knock on her door, but an uncomfortable feeling stopped me. It was as if my instinct was warning me to stay away. As the days passed, things got even stranger. In the mornings, the air outside her door was laden with an unpleasant odor, a sweet and nauseating mixture. I thought maybe he had left food behind, but the stench was persistent, almost invasive. One night, as I was returning home, I saw him take a black garbage bag out into the hallway. Out of it fell a dark, thick liquid that left a trail. No one else seemed to notice. My discomfort turned into obsession. I couldn't help but notice the details. He never turned on the lights. His curtains remained closed all the time, and I never saw him leave during the day. I began to watch his window at night. On more than one occasion, I swore that a shadow moved behind the curtains, as if someone was watching from inside. One night, a particularly loud clatter drew me out into the hallway. I walked toward her door with the intention of listening, but before I got there, I felt someone behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The feeling of being watched chilled my bones. I returned to my apartment, double-locking the door. As I sat on the couch trying to calm down, a nagging unease whispered to me that I had crossed an invisible boundary. The next morning, I found something outside my door, a white envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. The image was somewhat blurred, but unmistakable. It was me, standing in the hallway the night before, in front of the door to 4B. Fear gripped me. How had he gotten that photograph? How long had he been watching me? I wanted to confront him, but I couldn't find the courage. Instead, I took the photo to the building management, looking for answers. The manager could only tell me that the man had paid several months' rent in advance and had not communicated since his arrival. They didn't even have his full name. That night, the noises returned louder than ever. But this time, I heard something new. Voices. They were barely murmurs, but clearly human. They crept along the walls like twisted whispers. I tried to decipher what they were saying, but the words were unintelligible, distorted. I stayed awake all night, eyes glued to my door, unable to move. The next day, I decided to investigate. I talked to some neighbors, trying to find out something about him. No one knew anything. Some confessed to having noticed strange things, like smells or night noises, but no one seemed as affected as I was. My curiosity eventually overcame my fear. I decided to go into his apartment when he was gone. I had noticed that he usually left in the early hours of the morning, so I waited patiently. When I saw him leave, I took a wire and picked the lock. It was dark inside, and an unbearable stench hit me immediately. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and cautiously moved forward. The apartment was nearly empty, save for a few stacked boxes and a table in the center of the room. On the table there were tools, knives, wires, and something that looked like a heavy hammer. But what really captured my attention was a series of photographs. They were pictures of people in the building, taken from angles that suggested I had been spying on them for months. One of the photos was of a neighbor who had moved in suddenly weeks before. Another showed a man I knew had left the building months ago without saying where he was going. But what really chilled my blood was the last photo. It was of me, asleep in my bed. A noise behind me made me turn quickly. Footsteps coming down the hallway were unmistakable. I hurried out of the apartment and ran to mine, double-locking the door. Minutes later, I heard the footsteps stop outside my door. There was a soft knock, then another. I didn't answer. I held my breath, waiting for him to leave. Then I heard his voice for the first time. It was a whisper, barely audible, but enough to freeze my blood. "You should have been more careful." The next morning, apartment 4B was empty. There was no trace of him left. No trace of the photographs, no trace of the objects I had seen. It was as if he had never been there. Months passed, and then years. I moved apartments and tried to leave everything behind. But the paranoia followed me. I always had the feeling of being watched. Every strange noise made me startle. I never slept soundly again. 5 years later, while browsing through a newspaper in a coffee shop, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. On the front page was a photograph of the man in 4B. The headline read, "Serial Killer Arrested, Known as the Vigilante." I read the article with my heart racing. It said he had been caught in another city, thanks to an anonymous tip. They had found a network of apartments and hideouts where he stored photographs, tools, and macabre records of his crimes. Among the victims, I recognized 2 former neighbors from my building who had disappeared without a trace. The article ended with a chilling statement. The suspect, known for his methodical habits and ability to go unnoticed, had been watching his victims for months before he struck. I closed the newspaper and tried to calm down, but the vertigo was unbearable. I had lived next door to a killer, a man who had spied on me, stalked me, and perhaps considered me as his next victim. Since then, I have not been able to stop wondering why he let me live, or if perhaps he had been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I was always told that time heals all wounds, but I know that's not true. There are memories that don't dissolve, scars that don't stop hurting, and shadows that don't disappear. My childhood was marked by an event that I buried for years, or so I thought. I didn't count on the fact that sometimes the past doesn't stay still. I was 8 years old when it happened. We lived in a small neighborhood, a row of modest houses with unkempt front yards and bicycles lying in the yards. It was a quiet place, or at least it seemed so. My mother worked long hours, and my father had disappeared from our lives long before I could remember, so I spent most of my time alone, exploring the nooks and crannies of the neighborhood. There was a house at the end of the street that we all avoided. It was old, with peeling paint and windows that looked like dead eyes. Rumor had it that a man lived there, a loner who never went out during the day. No one saw him, but sometimes we heard noises, the creak of a door opening, footsteps on the porch, the distant echo of a radio. One afternoon, I remember the sky was overcast. My friends and I decided to defy our fear and approach. It was a kind of test of courage, the kind of thing kids do to impress each other. We took turns approaching one by one, touching the rusty fence or peeking through the basement window. When it was my turn, I got closer than the others. I remember peering through a crack in the wood of the basement door. The darkness was total, but my eyes caught something glowing, a pale reflection, like a face looking at me from the other side. I screamed and ran with the sound of nervous laughter behind me. That night, I dreamed of eyes in the dark watching me. What followed changed my life forever. A few days later, my mother left the house before dawn to go to work. I was supposed to stay asleep until the neighbor arrived to take care of me, but I woke up early with the feeling that something was wrong. The house was completely silent except for a faint rustling sound coming from downstairs. It was not unusual to hear noises in an old house, but this sound had a strange rhythm to it, as if someone was moving. I froze in bed, straining my ears. The creaking stopped, and after a long moment I heard it again, but this time closer. It was the sound of someone coming up the stairs. Fear paralyzed me. My mind tried to come up with a rational explanation, but none of them fit. Finally, I dared to move and hid in the closet. I heard my bedroom door open and the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Something stopped right in front of the closet. I don't know how much time passed, but when I mustered the courage to open the door, no one was there. However, something else was. A strange object placed on my desk. It was a small figure carved out of wood, grotesque and worn, with sunken eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I told no one what had happened. Something in me knew they wouldn't believe me, and part of me wanted to pretend nothing had happened. But from then on, The noises in the house became more frequent. Little creaks, knocks on the walls, and sometimes the feeling that someone was watching me from the dark. Eventually, my mother and I moved out and the house was left behind. I tried to move on, but I never felt completely safe. I was always accompanied by that feeling that something was following me, something I couldn't see but knew was there. Years later, as an adult, I thought I had left those childhood fears behind. I moved to a small apartment in a different city, far from everything that reminded me of that old house. But soon after settling in, things started happening again. First, it was the noises. At night, I would hear banging on the walls and footsteps in the hallway. At first, I attributed it to the neighbors, but soon I noticed that the sounds always came from the empty areas. Then the misplaced objects began. Keys were not where I had left them. A lamp would turn on by itself, and once I found one of my shirts hanging on the doorknob of the front door, although I was sure I had left it in the closet. The worst thing was the feeling of being watched. Whenever I was alone, I felt that someone was watching me, that there were eyes in every dark corner. One night, while trying to sleep, I opened my eyes and I could swear I saw a silhouette in the corner of the room, motionless, watching me. I tried to rationalize it, to think that stress was messing with my mind. But then one morning I found something on my desk that made me shudder. The same wood-carved figure that had appeared in my room when I was a kid. I called the police, convinced that someone had broken into my apartment. They checked everything and found no signs of intrusion. They told me that I had probably forgotten I had that object or that I had brought it with me without realizing it. But I knew the truth. I decided to investigate. I went back to the neighborhood where I grew up, hoping to find answers. The house at the end of the street was still there, abandoned and overgrown with weeds. I asked some neighbors, but no one knew anything about the man who had lived there. It was as if he had never existed. Finally, I found a record in the municipal archives. The house had belonged to a man named Elias Para, who had disappeared without a trace decades ago. The authorities never solved the case, but rumors had it that he had been involved in shady activities, kidnappings, and murders that were never proven. What I discovered later was even more disturbing. Among the records, there was a document that mentioned a secret basement in the house, a space that had never been officially recorded. I decided to go back and look for it. I found the entrance under an old rug on the living room floor. The basement was full of boxes and rusty tools, but what really caught my eye was a collection of carved wooden figures, all grotesque and similar to the one I had found in my room. Each figure had a name engraved on the base. When I searched through them, I found one with my name on it. My mind was filled with questions. How was that possible? Why was my name there? That's when I heard a rustling sound upstairs. Someone was there. I climbed the stairs with my heart in my throat, but the house was empty. But on the living room window, someone had written something with a finger in the dust on the glass, a simple, "I found you." I left there and never came back. But since then, the noises, the figures, and the feeling of being watched have not disappeared. I know now that no matter where I go, I can never escape, because what follows me is not a man, not a memory. It is the darkness left in me by the traumatic event of my childhood, a shadow that will never go away. And every night, when I close my eyes, I know it's there, waiting. My name is Diego, and I never thought I would get to tell this story. It's strange to look back and recognize the signs I ignored, the moments when I could have gotten out but didn't. When you're inside something that's consuming you, you're inside something that's consuming you. When you're inside something that consumes you, that traps you, it's hard to distinguish where reality ends and manipulation begins. This is the story of how I lost myself in a relationship that looked like love, but was actually a carefully constructed prison. It all started 5 years ago. At the time, I was in a complicated stage of my life. I had ended a long relationship and was feeling vulnerable, desperate to find something to fill the emptiness inside me. That's when I met Laura. I remember her walking into the coffee shop where I used to freelance. Her presence was magnetic. Everything about her seemed designed to attract attention, from her laugh to the way she walked. When our eyes met for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: excitement. We started dating, and at first everything was perfect. Laura was charming, attentive, always knew just what to say to make me feel special. It was as if she had studied every corner of my mind, knowing exactly what I needed to hear. Soon I began to open up to her in a way I hadn't done with anyone else. I told her about my insecurities, my failures, my broken dreams, and she listened to me, as if she really cared. But over time, that attention started to feel different. At first, it was little comments, things she would say to me casually, but that would just hang around in my head. If I mentioned a friend, she would hint that maybe I had feelings for that person. If I was late for work, she would ask me if I had really been in the office. They were always subtle comments, never direct, but incisive enough to make me doubt myself. Within a few months, our relationship had become intense. We spent all our time together, and although at first that seemed romantic to me, I began to feel suffocated. Laura wanted to know every detail of my day, who I talked to, what I was doing, where I was going. She said it was because she loved me, because she couldn't bear the thought of losing me. And I, believing that was love, gave in. Little by little, I stopped seeing my friends, going out alone, doing the things I enjoyed. My world narrowed down to her. The fight started after the first year. They were small at first, silly arguments about insignificant things, but they always ended the same. Me apologizing for something I didn't fully understand, and her assuring me that she was only doing it because she loved me. It was as if every fight was a reminder that the only way to keep the peace was to give in, to give up a little more of myself. I remember one night in particular when he asked me to show him my phone. He said it was for transparency, that if I had nothing to hide, I shouldn't care. I resisted at first, but his insistence was relentless. I agreed, and from that moment on, my privacy ceased to exist. He checked my messages, my emails, even my social networks. Every interaction with another person was analyzed, questioned, as if he was looking for proof that I was failing him in some way. The emotional abuse was not always overt. Laura had an uncanny ability to disguise her attacks as concerns or displays of affection. If she saw me getting tired, she would say it was because I didn't know how to organize myself well. If something went wrong at work, she implied that maybe I wasn't as good as I thought I was. His words were not direct insults, but each one was like a small crack in my self-esteem, until I began to believe that maybe he was right. The control came to a head when he asked me to quit my job. He said that freelancing was unstable, that he couldn't build a future with me if I wasn't able to offer him security. At that point, I was so emotionally worn out that I accepted. I got a permanent job, one that I wasn't passionate about, but that allowed me to meet his expectations. Of course, that wasn't enough. There was always something else I needed to change, something else I wasn't doing right. Eventually, I stopped recognizing myself. I was no longer the confident, passionate man I used to be. I had become someone who lived to please someone else, someone who constantly walked a tightrope, fearing that the slightest mistake would set off a storm. My friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. Laura had convinced me that they didn't understand our relationship, that they just wanted to separate us. My family, who had noticed the changes in me, also tried to intervene, but I ignored them. I didn't want to admit that maybe they were right. The breaking point came one night when, after a particularly intense argument, Laura threw my computer on the floor. I had spent hours working on an important project, and her act was a direct blow to what little dignity I had left. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized that I couldn't go on like this, that if I didn't do something, I would end up losing myself completely. Deciding to leave was the hardest thing I have ever done. Laura did not take it well, as expected. She cried, she begged, she promised to change. She said she couldn't live without me, that I was her world. For a brief moment, I almost gave in. But then I remembered who I was before I met her, the person I had lost in the process, and I knew I could no longer sacrifice my happiness for someone who only knew how to destroy me. When I left her, it wasn't the end of the nightmare. Laura would chase me, show up at my house, send endless messages. I came to fear for my safety, but over time, her attempts to control me diminished. Recovery was not immediate. It took me years to rebuild my confidence, my sense of identity, but I did it. Now, when I look back, I realize how fragile our perception of love can be, how it can be used as a tool to control us. I learned that true love doesn't destroy, doesn't isolate, doesn't force you to lose yourself. And although the scars are still there, I know that I survived, and that I will never let myself be trapped like that again. This story isn't just mine. It's a reminder to anyone who is trapped in a relationship that takes more from them than it gives. There is always a way out, even if it seems impossible at first. My name is Julian, and this is a story I would rather not have to tell. but sometimes bringing to light what torments us is the only way to leave it behind. What I'm about to relate began with something as everyday as it is today, an online encounter. However, what started as a harmless curiosity quickly turned into a spiral of anxiety, paranoia, and fear that has left me with scars that are difficult to heal. It all started a couple of years ago when I was going through a period of loneliness. I had just moved to a new city for work, and my days were reduced to long hours in front of the computer and empty nights in a small apartment that barely felt like mine. Although I had never been very active on social networks or dating apps, that feeling of isolation led me to download an anonymous chat platform. The idea of being able to talk to strangers without commitments or expectations seemed appealing, almost therapeutic. The first week was, as I expected, quite superficial. Brief conversations about trivial topics with people I would probably never see online again. But one evening, after a long day at the office, I received a message that, though simple, stood out among the others. It was an open-ended, somewhat philosophical question that seemed to seek a deeper connection. The person who sent it called himself Damien, and his manner of writing was polite, thoughtful, even a bit captivating. At first, our chats were fairly normal. We talked about books, music, and movies, and exchanged opinions on a variety of subjects. But there was something about Damien that I found intriguing. He seemed to know exactly what to say to keep me interested, and his messages were always perfectly calculated, as if he studied every word he used. In retrospect, I should have noticed that this perfection was too good to be true. Over time, our conversations became more personal. I felt comfortable sharing details about my life, my fears, and my dreams. Damien always seemed to listen attentively, and his answers gave me the impression that he understood me better than anyone else. It was then that he began to ask more about my daily routine. At first, I didn't think anything of it. What harm could it do for him to know what time I got off work or what my favorite coffee shop was? It seemed like normal, even genuine curiosity. As the weeks went on, the questions began to get more specific. He wanted to know the name of my building, what route I took on my way home, if I usually went out on weekends and with whom. Something about his insistence began to make me uncomfortable, but I was already so immersed in our virtual friendship that I convinced myself it was an irrational concern. I thought maybe he just wanted to get to know me better. One night, as I was walking back to my apartment, I received a message from Damien that chilled my blood. He described what I was wearing with eerie precision, from the color of my jacket to the backpack on my back. My heart raced instantly, and I looked around, searching for any familiar face or suspicious figure. The street was empty, and the only sound was the sound of my own hurried footsteps on the asphalt. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it must be a coincidence. Perhaps I had described my jacket to him in some earlier conversation and had forgotten. But when I got home, my mind was still working at full speed. I reviewed our past conversations, looking for some clue as to how he could have known so many details, but found nothing to explain his message. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to confront him in the chat room. I asked him directly how he knew what I was wearing and why he seemed so interested in my personal life. His response was evasive, saying it was just a joke and that I shouldn't worry. But something in his tone, even over text, struck me as calculating, as if he enjoyed my unease. My discomfort turned to paranoia when, a few days later, I found a note taped to my apartment door. It was nothing more than a blank piece of paper with a hand-drawn smile, but I felt a shiver run through my body. I tried to convince myself that someone else in the building had left the note by mistake, but deep down I knew it was connected to Damien. I decided to cut off all communication with him. I blocked his profile on the platform and deleted the app from my phone, hoping that would be enough to put it behind me. But it wasn't. Messages started coming to my personal email, something I had never shared with him. He was telling me that I was letting him down, that I couldn't just disappear like that. His words were a mixture of reproach and veiled threat, and every time I read one of his emails, I felt my world getting smaller. What terrified me most was his ability to know things about me that I had never told him. He would describe places he had recently visited, mention details of conversations he had had out loud while talking on the phone at home. I began to notice little things out of place in my apartment, as if someone had been there in my absence. A slightly moved lamp, a window letting in cold air that I didn't remember opening. I decided to change the locks and talk to the building manager, who assured me that no one else had access to my apartment. but my anxiety grew. I began to question whether I was losing my mind, whether this was all a figment of my imagination. The possibility that Damien was really close to me kept haunting me. The situation came to a head one night when, on my way home from work, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside were a series of photographs taken with a telephoto lens. They were of me, at different times of the day, entering the building, walking to the office, buying coffee on the corner. The level of detail in the images was frightening, and with each photo I felt my privacy, my security, crumbling. At that point, I decided to go to the police. I showed them the photos, the emails, and told them about the conversations with Damien. Although they took my complaint, they made it clear to me that they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. They advised me to be more careful and to avoid any contact with him. But even with those measures, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was always being watched. For weeks, my life became a game of survival. I changed my route to work, avoided the places I used to frequent, and stopped interacting online altogether. I installed security cameras in my apartment and slept with a baseball bat next to my bed. But the fear wouldn't go away. Every shadow, every sound, felt like a threat. One day, the messages stopped. I stopped finding notes or pictures, and for the first time in months, I began to feel calmer. But the damage was done. My trust in people, in technology, and even in my own perception had been shattered. Even today, every time someone tries to approach me, I can't help but wonder if their interest is genuine, or if there is something darker behind it. I never knew who Damien really was or how he managed to enter so deeply into my life. What I do know is that that experience taught me that danger doesn't always come from the visible or the obvious. Sometimes it hides behind a screen, disguised as interest and empathy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My name is Eduardo, and I never thought that life could hang by such a thin and fragile thread. Until that day, I was an ordinary man with a monotonous but stable routine. Every morning, I took the same route to work, dealing with the traffic, the noise of the city, and my own thoughts, which rarely led me to reflect on my mortality. But an unexpected event brought me face to face with the abyss, and the experience changed my perception of everything forever. It was an ordinary Monday, one of those days that start out lackluster and purposeless, but become an indelible memory. The office was especially tense due to an important meeting with a key client. I had slept little the night before, my head full of numbers and presentations. I hurried out of the house with an empty stomach and half-drunk coffee, something I would later deeply regret. I took the highway as usual, braving the traffic that seemed like a maze of frustration. I was used to that chaos. I knew which lanes were faster and which exits to avoid. But that morning, everything seemed to be against me. The weather was heavy, with gray clouds threatening rain. An accident in the opposite lane had slowed the flow even more, and impatient drivers were making dangerous maneuvers to gain a few yards. As I moved forward, I noticed a huge cargo truck changing lanes erratically, as if the driver was distracted or in a hurry. Something in me told me I should keep my distance, but the rush to get to work pushed me to overtake him. I took a small gap that opened up between two cars, accelerating past the truck. I was barely alongside it when I saw it start to turn into my lane. The impact was brutal. I felt a blow on the right side of my car that made me lose control. It all happened in seconds, but in my mind, time stretched out like an elastic band. The sound of metal twisting and glass popping filled my ears as the car spun and slid down the road. I remember trying to hold the steering wheel tightly, but it was no use. My car slammed into the crash barrier and then was pushed to the other side of the road. When it stopped, I found myself trapped in the seat, my body shaking and a feeling of vertigo that prevented me from processing what had just happened. For an instant, everything was silent, as if the world had stopped to give me a break. Then pain began to invade my body. A sharp stabbing pierced my chest, and my legs were trapped under the dashboard, which had been deformed by the impact. The smell of burning fuel and plastic made me cough, and I felt a growing heat coming from the engine. I screamed for help, but my voice was barely audible over the ringing in my ears. People began to gather some distance away, some with their phones in hand, recording or calling 911. Others seemed too frightened to approach. The truck, which had caused the accident, had stopped a few meters ahead. The driver staggered out, a mixture of horror and confusion on his face. I don't remember feeling hatred towards him at the time, just a deep desperation to get out of that metal trap before it was too late. The heat was rising, and I saw small flames begin to sprout under the hood. My mind went into a panic. I thought about my family, my wife Anna and our young children. I thought about how that might be the last time I would see daylight. Adrenaline took over, and I began to push with all my might to free my legs, ignoring the pain that cut through me like knives. Finally, a brave man, who I later learned was named Javier, approached the car. He broke the passenger side window with a tool he carried in his truck and began to pull the door open. His face was covered in sweat and ash, and his hands were shaking as he struggled against the twisted metal. He managed to open a space large enough for him to drag me out. As he pulled me out, the fire began to spread. I felt the heat on my back and heard the small but terrifying explosions coming from the engine. Javier carried me away from the car just before the flames completely consumed it. I was laid on the ground, and someone covered my wounds with a cloth. I could barely breathe, and the pain in my chest was unbearable. A woman who seemed to have medical knowledge was trying to reassure me as she checked my pulse. Her words were a distant whisper, but her presence was an anchor in the midst of the chaos. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was already on the verge of unconsciousness. I felt them carefully lift me up and place me on a stretcher. The sound of sirens was the last thing I heard before everything faded away. I woke up in the hospital, surrounded by white lights and with a stabbing pain coursing through my body. A doctor explained that I had suffered multiple fractures, internal contusions, and a partial collapse of my right lung. I had undergone emergency surgery to stabilize my condition, and was told that I had been lucky to survive. The following weeks were a constant battle. Physical therapy, additional surgeries, and endless sleepless nights became my new reality. But the biggest challenge was not physical. It was psychological. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived the accident. The flames, the screams, the feeling of helplessness. It all came back to me like a relentless wave. I learned that the driver of the truck had been arrested. According to investigations, he had been working excessive hours without rest, which probably caused his inattention on the road. I couldn't blame him entirely. It was a broken system that had put him in that situation. But that didn't ease my pain or erase the scars, both internal and external. Eventually, I learned to walk again, though each step reminded me how close I came to never walking again. My family was my greatest support. Anna never left my side, and my children, though young, seemed to understand that their dad had come back from something few survive. That experience changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. I now value each day as a gift, cliché as it sounds. I've learned to appreciate the little things, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of my children's laughter, the feel of the sun on my skin. But I also carry with me a burden, a lesson I didn't ask to learn. Life is fragile, and it can change in an instant. That near-death experience showed me how vulnerable we are, but also how resilient we can be when we face the unimaginable. Now, every time I pass that highway, I slow down and look back at the place where I almost lost everything. I do so, not with fear, but with gratitude, reminding myself that I survived to tell this story and to live, fully conscious, for the rest of my days. My name is York, and a couple of years ago I lived an experience that I will never forget, one that haunts me every day of my life. It all started when an old friend, Alvaro, told me about a place I'd always heard rumors about, an abandoned place on the outskirts of the city where the echoes of the past still seemed to whisper in its walls. Alvaro, with his curious nature and insatiable desire for the unknown, invited me to accompany him on an expedition to explore the site. I thought it would be just another adventure, something we would laugh about in the future. But what happened that night changed everything. The place had been closed for more than 20 years. According to the stories that circulated during its time of operation, it was known for the questionable methods applied to those who were there. It was said that some of them were never released, and that their lost souls still roamed the corridors. Stories told of cruel experiments, of people forgotten, of screams drowned out by the walls that never received help. Despite the rumors, there was something in me that drew me to the place. Perhaps it was the feeling of being able to discover something that most would prefer to avoid, the opportunity to unravel a piece of dark history that the city had preferred to forget. Alvaro nagged me for weeks until I finally agreed. We met one afternoon, loaded with flashlights, cameras, and a couple of bottles of water, with the promise to return before night fell completely. However, fate had other plans. The site was located about a 2-hour drive outside of town. As we got closer, the road became narrower and narrower. The trees covered the sky, and the air seemed to get thicker. When we arrived, the silhouette of the building loomed like a shadow on the horizon. A huge 3-story building with broken windows and cracked walls, as if time had completely engulfed it. From the first glimpse, something about the atmosphere was strange. The air was heavy, as if the atmosphere was permeated with something that could not be named. Alvaro was excited. I, on the other hand, felt a slight discomfort, a strange sensation that I could not identify. We decided to enter through one of the back doors, which was half broken, and cautiously crossed the threshold. The first impression was of emptiness. A long, dark hallway with closed doors on both sides welcomed us. The place was completely silent, and although the building appeared to be in ruins, everything was still surprisingly intact. The mold-covered walls, the floor full of debris and dust, and the emergency lights flickering dimly created an ominous atmosphere that gradually enveloped us. We walked through the corridors with silent steps, exploring the rooms around us. In some, there were still remnants of furniture, rusty beds, broken chairs, yellowed papers scattered on the floor. In others, there was nothing left, only the elongated shadows that seemed to move with us. Alvaro was taking pictures and recording videos, completely absorbed in his enthusiasm, while I tried to stay alert. From time to time, I would hear the creaking of wood under our feet or the distant sound of something tapping at the bottom of the building. I tried not to give it too much importance, attributing it to the wind or the passage of time. We moved floor by floor, moving deeper and deeper into the building. When we reached the 3rd floor, the sensations that invaded me were more and more intense. The air felt even thicker, as if it were about to overflow, as if the walls themselves wanted to swallow us up. Alvaro kept talking about how incredible it was to be there, but I couldn't stop staring at the empty rooms, the dark corners where it seemed like something could watch us. It was in one of those moments when we heard the sound. At first, it was nothing more than a distant murmur, something that could have been mistaken for wind. But then it became clearer. A whisper, as if someone was speaking in a low, almost inaudible tone from one of the nearby rooms. Alvaro looked at me, and for a moment, we were both silent, trying to identify the source of that noise. At first, I thought it might be an echo, a sound reflecting off the walls. But as we approached the room where it was coming from, an uncomfortable feeling came over me. It was as if the whole building was breathing with us, as if the walls were watching us, waiting for something. We decided to go inside. The door was locked, but it opened easily, as if it had been waiting for us to touch it. The room was empty, with a single broken window letting in the moonlight, but the atmosphere there was completely different. The feeling of cold was palpable, and the air seemed heavier, charged with something I couldn't identify. In one of the corners, we found an old wheelchair covered with dust, and on it, an open book. The book, although it was almost unreadable due to the passage of time, had something disturbing about it. On the yellowed pages, I could make out what looked like a name, but it was too blurry to read clearly. I bent down to inspect more closely, and that's when I saw it. Strange marks, as if someone had scratched the pages with something sharp. Suddenly, a sound from the next room made us jump. It was a dull thud, as if something had fallen to the floor. Alvaro rushed forward, as always driven by his curiosity, while I hesitated for a moment. My instinct told me that we should not continue, but something inside me pushed me to follow him. When we entered the next room, we found a cluttered desk, papers scattered on the floor, and a large stain of something dark covering the floor. At first, I thought it was ink, but when I bent down to take a closer look, I realized it was something much worse. It was blood. I wasn't sure how it had gotten there, but the stain looked fresh. In that instant, everything about the building, the whole mystery, began to take a more sinister turn. My heart began to beat faster, and a sense of danger came over me. I looked at Alvaro, who seemed to be as engrossed in the place as ever, but I couldn't help thinking that something was terribly wrong. It was then that the door slammed shut without explanation. The noise of the lock echoed in my ears like a scream, and a sense of panic came over me. Suddenly, the darkness became even thicker, and all I could hear was the sound of our gasping breaths. I tried to open the door, but I couldn't. I was trapped. I was trapped. A claustrophobic feeling came over me, and the silence became unbearable. I looked around, searching for a way out, but the building seemed to be changing, transforming into something even more oppressive. It was then that I heard footsteps behind me, footsteps that were neither mine nor Alvaro's. I turned quickly but saw nothing. My mind began to go frantic, searching for explanations, but there were none. Alvaro was standing in front of me, looking at the ground, as if he didn't see me. I tried to call out to him, but he didn't answer. At that instant, something snapped in my mind. The building, that place, was no longer just an abandoned place. There was something else, something that was trapping us, that was pulling us into its forgotten history. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave Alvaro. I couldn't abandon him there. The watch on my wrist was ticking, but the time no longer made sense. And it was when the door opened, as if something had decided to let us escape, that I understood what had happened. What had been lurking there was not something tangible. We left the building that night, with the feeling of having narrowly escaped. We never spoke of what happened again. I tried to forget, but the shadows of what we saw and felt in those hallways always return, reminding me that there are places that should never be explored. And sometimes when I find myself in the dark, I can still hear those footsteps. My name is Jonathan, and I always knew my life would not be easy. Ever since I was a child, my parents taught me to face life's difficulties with an attitude of resilience. But I never imagined that the hardest thing I would have to face would come not from an accident or an unexpected tragedy, but from something much closer to home, something I couldn't control, a shadow that took over my family over time, my brother Dixon's addiction. Dixon and I were inseparable as children. We grew up together in a modest home surrounded by our parents' love, though life was never easy. From a young age, our relationship was marked by healthy competition, by that rivalry that only siblings can have. We were always trying to prove who was the best at everything, although in the end we knew that life was more a matter of mutual support than of defeating the other. I understood that too late. I remember it all started when Dixon was 17. I was 19 at the time, and I was already beginning to see how adolescence was transforming him. He became more distant, quieter. At first I thought it was part of that growing up process, that need to become independent. But what really happened was that Dixon entered a dark world that I had no idea about. He started changing his circle of friends, hanging out with people he didn't know anything about, and he started being away from home more. I, of course, was busy with my own life, my studies, and my friends. I didn't pay much attention to him. What happened next was gradual, almost imperceptible. The first changes were small, almost invisible. Dixon started sleeping more during the day and became more irritable at night. Sometimes he didn't eat well, and his appearance began to deteriorate. But I didn't see the warning signs. I didn't understand what was happening. It was then that one day, while looking for something in his room, I found some small bags of white powder hidden in a drawer, along with a syringe. At that moment, I felt as if the floor vanished from under my feet. The image of what I had found hit me in the chest like a clenched fist. At first, I denied it. I thought I was wrong, that maybe Dixon was experiencing some passing crisis, or that this was something he could control on his own. But that idea was quickly replaced by the cruel and definitive reality that my brother was lost in the grip of an addiction. It wasn't something you could ignore, something you could dismiss with a simple, "It's not happening." No, it was a real, tangible monster, feeding on your fears, your insecurities, your voids. I remember the first time I tried to confront him. It was one afternoon when Dixon came home after being away for several days. He was thin, pale, and his eyes had an empty look in them, as if his soul was no longer fully in his body. I plucked up my courage and confronted him. I asked him to explain to me what was going on, why he was doing this. But Dixon just looked at me, and his response was a dense, almost unbearable silence. It was a silence full of resentment, of pain, but also of disdain, as if he was reproaching me for not knowing anything, as if everything that was happening to him was my fault. What happened from then on was a cycle that repeated itself over and over again. Failed attempts at rehabilitation, broken promises, endless arguments, and an anguish that ate me up inside. I tried to help him in every way I could. I paid for him to go to detox centers. I took him to therapy. I tried to make him see that there was something beyond drugs, that he could rebuild his life. But it was all in vain. The addiction had him completely in its grip, and every time I thought he was recovering, he would fall again, deeper than before. Sadness and exhaustion began to affect me as well. Not only was I witnessing Dixon's deterioration, but I also felt as if my own life was falling apart. The constant fights between my parents, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty of not knowing what to expect the next day was wearing me down inside. Dixon's addiction was a disease that was not only destroying him, but was disintegrating our family. In his struggle with drugs, he was dragging everyone around him down, and we didn't know how to stop him. There was a time when I thought that maybe, just maybe, if we let him hit rock bottom, if we didn't rescue him, he would finally open his eyes and look for a way out. But that never happened. The only thing that happened was that Dixon got further and further away from all of us. The people who were once his family became like strangers he avoided, while he surrounded himself with people who pushed him down that dark path. The last time I saw Dixon with a shred of humanity was one evening when he showed up home in the wee hours of the morning. He was drunk, and his breathing was ragged. He stared at me, and for a few seconds I thought I would see the brother I had known before, the one who played with me as a child, the one who shared his dreams and worries with me. But he didn't. Instead, he told me something that still pains me to remember. "Don't worry, Jonathan, I'm not the one who's missing out. I'm all I have left." Then he collapsed to the ground, and I could do nothing more than watch him fade before my eyes. Time passed and life went on, though I could no longer live the life I had imagined. My brother continued to fall lower and lower, farther and farther away. I saw him less, and when I did, he was no longer the Dixon I knew, but a shadow of his former self. His eyes, once full of life, now only reflected the emptiness of a broken existence. 2 years ago, I received a call in the wee hours of the morning. The voice on the other end of the line was that of a man I didn't know, but who informed me that Dixon had been found in an alley, passed out with obvious signs of an overdose. He was alive, but had been near death. At that moment, I felt like a part of me had died too. How could my brother have come to this? How did we get here? Those questions had no answers, only the echo of pain. Dixon survived that overdose, but the truth is he was never the same. His health was broken, his mind filled with invisible scars. He spent his last days wandering between hospitals, shunning any kind of help. And finally, he passed away under circumstances we never fully understood. Some said his body couldn't take it anymore. Others claimed his soul was gone long before. I was left with the emptiness, the regret of not having been able to do more, of not having known how to save him. Today, after all I have lived through, I still face the reality that addiction took my brother away, but I also learned a painful lesson, that sometimes, no matter how much you love someone, you can't save them if they are not willing to save themselves. Addiction is not a battle you can win alone, and sometimes, the people you love the most drag you down into the same pit with nothing you can do about it. My brother Dixon is gone. And although I still struggle with memories and unanswered questions, in the end I know that his story was not unique, that there are many like him, trapped in the darkness of their own decisions, looking for a way out that never comes. My name is Victor, and my whole life has been marked by a heavy silence, one that has been present for as long as I can remember. I have grown up without knowing the full truth about my family, in a home that, despite being seemingly normal, always left me with more questions than answers. It was after my mother's death that the silence was broken and the shadows of my past began to come to light. It all started one rainy day as I was going through the papers my mother had left behind. She was always a very private person, rarely talking about her past and never mentioning her family beyond what was strictly necessary. There was a box, hidden in the back of her closet, full of old documents and photographs. I decided to rummage through it, hoping to find something that would give me a little more clarity about who my mother really was. A woman who, despite being loving, always seemed distant to me, as if there was something inside her that I couldn't share. That's when I found the diary. At first, it didn't strike me as something important. It was a small leather notebook with a weathered cover. It didn't seem like something that could reveal anything significant to me, but as I opened it, I felt a strange foreboding. The first few pages were filled with the thoughts and reflections of someone who was clearly looking for something he couldn't find. The handwriting was delicate, almost poetic, but something about the words made me pause. The journal belonged to someone named Abel, a name I was unfamiliar with. The first mention of him puzzled me. In the first few pages, my mother described Abel as a man who had been very close to her in her youth, someone who had been present in her life at crucial moments. As I read further, I began to realize that something didn't fit. There was something in her words that made me uncomfortable. My mother spoke of Abel with an almost obsessive admiration, and her words seemed imbued with a feeling much deeper than friendship. What surprised me most was what I read later. On one of the pages, my mother wrote about an encounter with Abel, an encounter that seemed to have changed the course of her life. She talked about how fate had brought them together again, how repressed emotions rose to the surface, and how that relationship, so complex and heartbreaking, led them to make decisions that, at the time, seemed to be the only possible thing to do. As I read on, my mother's words became more chaotic, more desperate. In one entry, almost fleetingly, she wrote, "Abel is everything to me, but we are more than brothers, and the love we share cannot be understood by anyone else." I didn't understand what I was reading, but something inside me told me that what I was about to discover would change my life forever. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with the journal. Every time I read a page, bewilderment and fear gripped me. One day, at the end of a particularly disturbing entry, my mother wrote something that chilled me to the bone. "The child I am expecting is not mine alone. It's Abel's, and even if the world doesn't understand, I can't live with this secret much longer." At that moment, my stomach churned. I began to understand what my mother had meant, but I didn't want to accept the horrible reality that was beginning to take shape before me. My mother had had a child by her own brother, by Abel. I was the product of incest. I sat back in my chair, staring at the newspaper in disbelief. My heart was pounding as if it were about to explode. My mind could not process what I had just read. How was it possible that no one had told me the truth? Why had they kept this from me all my life? How could it be that I, an ordinary person, was marked by such a monstrous secret? I was overcome with pain and confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about my mother, how she had lived with this secret, how she had raised me with love, but at the same time, had hidden this truth that not only involved me, but my entire family. I didn't know if I should feel angry with her, or if I should understand the torment she had lived through, knowing that something so forbidden had marked her life and mine. I decided to investigate further. I started talking to some people who knew my mother and Abel. What I discovered left me even more disturbed. Some spoke of Abel as if he were a tragic figure, someone trapped in his own destiny. Others simply avoided talking about him. What surprised me most was that, despite the gravity of what had happened, no one in the family seemed willing to bring up the subject. It was as if everyone had made a pact of silence, as if not talking about it could erase the reality. At one point, I decided to confront my father, or rather the man I always thought was my father. I showed him the diary, the picture of Abel I had found between the pages, and asked him directly, "Is Abel really my uncle?" My father's gaze went dead as soon as he saw the photograph. He didn't say anything to me at first, but I could see in his eyes that everything I had read was true. My mother had had an incestuous relationship with her brother, and I was the result of that forbidden union. My existence was a lie that had been kept hidden for years. My father, in a broken voice, confessed the truth to me. He explained that when my mother became pregnant by Abel, the situation had become untenable. They both knew that what they had done was wrong, but they couldn't help it. The love they shared, though forbidden, had been so deep that it had led them to break the rules of society, to ignore the consequences. My mother, realizing what had happened, had decided to stay away from her brother forever, and to keep their relationship a secret. But that secret had not only been a burden for her, but also for me. Eventually, the truth came out, but it was a slow process. My mother never spoke to me directly about what had happened. She never told me that I was the child of incest. All she knew was that at some point, I had been born into an environment full of lies. My mother had tried to live her life as if nothing had happened, but the shadow of what she did always haunted her. Now, with the diary in my hands and the truth unveiled before my eyes, I don't know what to make of it all. My world, which once seemed solid and clear, is now full of cracks. My family's secret is no longer just a rumor, no longer just a hidden story. I am the child of incest, and while that truth consumes me, it also makes me wonder, who am I really? What does it mean to be part of a family marked by something so dark? All I can do now is live with that secret, with that truth and try to find a way to understand who I am in the midst of it all. I may never be able to fully accept it, but at least now I know the truth. And that is a burden that, although difficult to bear, is mine. My name is Joaquin, and until recently my life was everything one could hope for. I worked as a lawyer in a respectable firm, had a family I loved, and a generally quiet life. But all that changed one rainy winter night. That night, the one that changed my fate and my perception of the world, began with a phone call. It was a call I wasn't expecting, but at the same time, I knew it would come sooner or later. The voice on the other end of the line was that of Raul, an old college friend with whom I had lost contact after finishing my studies. The same voice that had shared so many hours of laughter and projects now sounded low, almost broken. He asked me to see him, no matter how late it was. That tone of urgency in his voice alarmed me, so without thinking too much, I headed to the place where he had summoned me. When I arrived, the place was a small bar on the outskirts of the city. It was empty, barely illuminated by a warm lamp, which gave it a somber air. I saw Raul in a corner, drinking something that looked like whiskey, although I never knew if it was what he was really drinking because his face was tense, unhinged. There was something in his gaze that I could not recognize. As I approached, I felt a kind of strange coldness run down my back, as if the atmosphere was permeated with something else. Raul stared at me and without a word began to tell me what had happened. He told me in a broken voice that he had uncovered a huge web of corruption and abuse of power in the firm where we worked together years ago. He said that some of the senior partners were involved in a fraud case that, if revealed, would end many people's careers, including mine. He spoke of dirty money, of bribes, of illegal acts that only a few knew about. He explained to me that he had found irrefutable proof in the form of documents, but that before he could do anything with them, someone had discovered it, and since then his life had been in danger. Worst of all, he told me that someone had decided to take matters into their own hands in a much more radical way. That someone, according to him, not only wanted to silence the truth, but wanted to eliminate all traces of those who knew about the crimes. Raul confessed to me that before he could hand over the evidence to the authorities, he had been attacked. First there were the threats, then some men intercepted him one night as he was returning from a meeting with one of the informants he had contacted. And, the surprise phone call, his life was at stake. The only way to save himself was to act before the others did. Raul's story moved me, but it also terrified me. Although I knew what he was saying could be true, I couldn't help but feel guilty knowing that the system that had given us so much could also be so corrupt. However, as a lawyer, I had always believed in justice and the law, and now that belief was being tested. If Raul was right, and I didn't doubt his word, I had to act somehow to keep this from getting out of control. We stayed there in that bar for hours. We planned what we should do, go to the authorities, present the evidence, report the crime. But deep in my heart, something wouldn't let me be calm. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together. I knew that if we decided to go to the police, our fate would be sealed. The same men who had pursued Raul would also find me. After all, the firm we worked for was not only powerful, but also controlled many other key players in the city. At that moment, I realized that there was not much time left. Revenge was taking over my mind. Something inside me began to question everything I had been, everything I knew. Justice. What kind of justice was it that forgot the victims while the guilty continued to laugh from their thrones? Raul looked at me as if reading my thoughts, knowing that I was making an irreversible decision. We had discussed what to do, and suddenly, it no longer mattered. It was too late to turn back. I decided I couldn't let it all stay that way. The thought of destroying the lives of those who had enriched themselves on the desperation of others, those who had manipulated the system for their own benefit, blinded me. It was not just revenge, it was justice. That dark desire to teach them a lesson, to make them pay for their crimes, consumed me completely. I decided to act, and my first move was to destroy the evidence Raul had obtained. I knew that if it fell into the wrong hands, the consequences would be even worse. But somehow I was willing to risk it all. I began to thoroughly investigate Raul's contacts. I immersed myself in the world of the firm's finances, looking for any flaws, any details I could use against him. I knew I had to be quick. Days later, I managed to gather a series of evidence linking key partners to a money laundering network. Now, my revenge had form. It was no longer just for Raoul, but also for all those who, like him, had been victims of that corrupt machinery. At first, things were easy. I used my access to documents and network of contacts to move the pieces. I leaked key information that reached the media, even the firm's rivals. But not everything went as planned. What seemed so simple quickly became complicated. The first effects of my revenge came with frightening speed. The firm began to crumble, but with it so did many other lives. Some of the partners were arrested, others went into exile, but threats to my family also began to emerge. My wife, my children, they began to be the targets of those who could not allow the secrets to come out. My plan had taken an unexpected turn. Raoul, who had been the spark that ignited everything, was one of the first to disappear. No one knows what happened to him. Maybe we will never know, or maybe he is in the shadows running away from those who set him up. I never saw him again. The unintended consequences of my actions began to weigh too heavily on my shoulders. What began as an attempt to do justice, to balance the scales, became a spiral of destruction. Everything spiraled out of control, and now, as I look back, I wonder if I really did the right thing. My vengeance, that need to make the guilty pay, has left a mark that I cannot erase. I have destroyed lives, but I have also destroyed myself in the process. Now I am a lonely man, my conscience stained by the decisions I made. Justice sometimes is not what you expect, and the price you pay for seeking it, for pursuing it, is higher than anyone could imagine. My story, which began with a simple phone call, has ended in something much bigger, much darker, something I could not have foreseen. And now, the only price I can pay for all this is to live with the consequences. My name is German and I am a policeman. I have worked in the homicide department for more than a decade. During this time I have seen everything. Violent deaths, unsolved murders, lies, betrayals. I've learned to keep my cool, to not get carried away by emotions. But what happened a few months ago changed my perspective on everything I thought I knew about justice. It all started with a seemingly ordinary case, one that entered the docket as just another murder. A man's body was found in an alley on the outskirts of town. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no clear motive. The initial report pointed to a fight that had escalated and ended in tragedy. But something about the case bothered me from the start. There was something about that dead man that didn't fit what met the eye. The victim's name was Guillermo Rios. He was a 35-year-old guy, known in the nearby neighborhoods as someone with several dubious contacts, although he had never had a serious criminal record. In his life, he had been a seemingly ordinary man, but with the wrong friends. As we began to investigate, we discovered that Guillermo had a number of connections to local mafia figures, but what really caught my attention was something that none of my companions saw. A small leather notebook hidden in his jacket, almost as if it had been placed there on purpose. The notebook was filled with names and numbers, some of which made no sense at all. But what really puzzled me was one specific page. It was handwritten in red ink and contained a list of people, some of them with names that seemed familiar to me. Among those names was mine. At first I thought it was a mistake, that someone had simply mistaken a policeman for someone else. But no, that list contained information that only I knew. And when I saw what was at the bottom of the page, I understood that Guillermo's killer was not a stranger. The killer was someone very close to me, someone within my own circle. I decided to continue investigating the case on my own. The police had no solid leads. The case seemed to fall into oblivion, like so many others. But I couldn't let it go. The list in that notebook made it clear to me that this was not just a simple settling of scores, not just another victim of urban violence. There was something much bigger at stake, something that went back years, something that involved people I knew very well. I began to track down the other names on the list. Some were public figures, some were local businessmen, but most were people I had worked with before on the force. It took me months to put the pieces of the puzzle together, but I managed to uncover the truth. Guillermo was not a random victim. He had been investigating a network of corruption within the police itself. A network that involved bribery, extortion, and a series of crimes that no one in the department wanted to come to light. Guillermo had discovered that several of my colleagues, some of whom I had worked side by side with for years, were involved in a money laundering scheme that extended through various illegal companies and businesses in the city. Guillermo's notebook contained all those details, including the names of the cops behind the operation. And worst of all, what shook me to the core was that my name was on the list. It was not the name of a simple policeman, but the name of someone who had received a share of the money. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I started going through the bank accounts, receipts, and transfers, it all started to add up. I had been involved, although I wasn't aware of it at the time. My mind began to spin. Everything I had believed about my work, about my life, began to crumble. For years, I had considered myself an upright man, a man of justice. But now, upon discovering that I was involved in this network, I didn't know what to do. Would I denounce others and lose everything I had worked for so long? Or would I shut up and go on with my life, ignoring the price paid by the victims? I found myself caught in a tangle of lies and guilt. What had begun as a search for the truth about Guillermo's murder turned into something much darker. My colleagues, those I had worked with for years, were involved in things I would never have imagined. And at the same time, I realized that Guillermo's killer was one of them. It had been no ordinary fight, but a carefully planned execution. Finally, my morale got the better of me. I knew I could no longer be part of something so corrupt. I decided to act. But in a world as corrupt as the one I had discovered, doing so without consequences was not possible. I had decided to do justice, but I knew that meant risking my life. First, I approached a journalist I trusted, someone I knew could get the truth to the authorities. I gave him all the information, the documents, Guillermo's notebook, everything. But I didn't expect the network to be so extensive. That same day, a couple of hours after the delivery, I received an anonymous message that took my breath away. "We know what you are doing, and they won't let you get very far." It was a direct threat, a warning I could not ignore. Regardless, the story leaked, and before long, the names of the culprits began to be revealed. My companions, the ones I had considered my friends, were arrested, but not before trying to cover their tracks. The city shook with scandal, and I found myself caught in a whirlwind of denunciations and reprisals. What happened next was beyond anything I had imagined. People began to doubt all police officers, even those who had nothing to do with the scandal. The trust that had been built up over the years crumbled. The price I paid for the truth was far greater than I had anticipated. My life would never be the same. I knew the weight of my decisions would haunt me forever. And as I watched the guilty fall, I wondered if I had really done the right thing. I had sought justice, but the cost had been far greater than I could bear. It had destroyed my career, my family, everything I had built. The price of truth, as they always say, is high, but no one told me it was also so lonely. Now, I find myself alone, out of the department, with a life marked by my choices. My name is no longer the same, not in my own mind, and even though justice was done, guilt still haunts every step I take. My name is Raul, and I am someone who generally prefers to stay away from surprises. My life is routine, predictable, and I have always tried to avoid the unexpected. But sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. It puts you right in the middle of an experience that defies all logic and common sense, and all you can do is move on. 6 months ago, I was on a business trip. One of those meetings you don't need, but you know you must. The city I was heading to was not particularly attractive. A gray place surrounded by mountains and with a humid climate that always made you feel uncomfortable. I left the office early at 2 p.m. with the intention of catching the first available train so as not to miss the rest of the day. My head was full of work and my thoughts were constant, focused on the things I had to do and the problems to solve. Arriving at the station, I realized that I had arrived too late for the train I had planned to take, so I was forced to take a bus. It was the only option available. The sun was beginning to set and the sky was tinged with a strange orange color, creating an atmosphere of melancholy in the air. I didn't like buses. I always found them uncomfortable, and even more, I felt out of place with the people who used to ride them. But there was no other choice, so I got on. The bus was almost empty, just a few people scattered around the seats, sitting quietly. I settled in a window, picked up a small backpack I had with me, and plunged into my thoughts. I was tired, but I couldn't stop thinking about the pending work, about what awaited me when I arrived. But suddenly someone sat down next to me. I was a bit surprised because, as I said, the bus was quite empty. It was a man about 40 years old with a dark beard, a leather jacket, and eyes that I couldn't quite make out. He was not the kind of person I would normally encounter on a trip. His presence was unsettling somehow. I said nothing, just kept looking out the window, hoping the conversation wasn't unavoidable. For a few minutes, the man said nothing. He just stood there, watching the scenery slowly glide by under the wheels of the bus. It didn't take him long to break the silence. He began to speak softly, almost as if he wasn't really talking to me. First, he mentioned that he was traveling to a nearby city on a personal matter, something about important business. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes people feel the need to talk about things with strangers. It wasn't my case, but for some reason it didn't bother me. Maybe it was his low tone of voice, his way of expressing himself. He didn't seem dangerous, but something about his attitude made me feel uncomfortable. Little by little, his words began to become stranger. He talked about the decisions he had made in life, about his work, about the road he had traveled. He said that he had lived through a lot and that, despite what it might seem, he had been a very lucky man. I didn't understand, but simply nodded my head in agreement. What disturbed me most was not what he said, but how he said it. His gaze became fixed, as if he was not looking at the present, but at something much more distant. It was as if his words had no connection with the reality of which we were both a part. Then, in the middle of the conversation, he mentioned something that made my hair stand on end. He told me that he had never been to that city before, but he knew something about it that few knew. Something obscure, something that no one wanted to talk about, but that was very present. At the time, I thought he was just making some kind of weird joke, or maybe he was getting carried away with his own paranoia. Over my years of experience as a businessman, I had learned to listen to a lot of people, but I rarely got carried away with what they were saying. Something about his words made me uncomfortable. As the conversation continued, he began to mention places and situations that seemed to make no sense. He was talking about a person he met many years ago, someone he had left behind in that city. His face became somber as he said that person's name, as if he was seeing something he could not understand. In his voice there was something of regret so deep that it made me feel that something dark lurked behind his words. It was at that moment that he began to speak more intensely. He said there was a secret, something that many did not know, something that would change the lives of all who knew him. When he mentioned that secret, my eyes opened a little wider. The bus was moving along the winding road. Night had already settled in, and the lights inside the vehicle were dim, creating an even stranger atmosphere. The city was only a few minutes away, and the man continued to speak more and more urgently. I felt trapped in his speech. I couldn't stop looking at him, listening to those words that, although they didn't seem to make sense, enveloped me in a sense of unease. There was something unsettling in the way he spoke. It was as if he knew something I didn't, as if his words carried a weight I couldn't understand. Suddenly, he leaned toward me and whispered in my ear, "Remember that not everything you see is what it seems. Sometimes what is in front of you is just a mirage. Beware of what may happen when we arrive." Something in his tone, in his look, made me feel I couldn't trust him. I didn't understand exactly what it was that I was afraid of. The man got up from his seat and headed toward the back of the bus, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. For a few minutes I stood frozen, staring down the road, sensing that something was about to happen. But I told myself I shouldn't be so paranoid. I was just a weird guy, right? I couldn't let something so insignificant affect me. The city arrived at the next stop. The bus began to slowly come to a stop. The station lights illuminated the surroundings with a sort of haze that failed to clear. I was too tired to think, but somehow the atmosphere in that place gave me an uneasy feeling. When I got off the bus, I looked for the exit and started walking towards the hotel where I would be staying. Suddenly, a figure appeared next to me, almost like a reflection. It was him, the man from the bus. I didn't know how he had gotten there so fast. Before I could react, he said to me, "Did you know that everything around you is controlled by an invisible network? You can't escape it." And I'm not sure you understood what I said. At that moment, I felt fear growing inside me. This man was not a stranger. He had something to do with my destiny, something I could not understand. I knew that my life would never be the same after that encounter, and worst of all, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled into something much bigger, much darker that I couldn't avoid. My name is Pablo, and I work as a receptionist in a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. For years, my job has been quiet, more routine than interesting. What I do most on an average day is welcome guests, hand out keys, and make sure everything is in order. But that night, one person forever changed my perception of people and what a smile can really hide. That night started out like any other. The sky was gray, rain was falling slowly on the asphalt, and the wind was blowing dry leaves across the sidewalk. The hotel was small, with no more than 10 rooms, but there was always something welcoming in its simplicity. It had been a haven for weary travelers for years, people who just needed a night's rest before continuing on their way. But that night, a customer changed the routine. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, as the light faded and darkness blanketed the city, a man arrived at the front desk. I noticed him instantly. He was not particularly tall, thin, or fat. His clothes were simple, a dark coat that looked to be a bit old and worn leather shoes, but his eyes were undoubtedly what caught my attention the most. Although I didn't see them clearly at first, there was something in his gaze that I found disturbing. He was not the type of customer one expects to see in a hotel like ours. He approached the counter and gave me his name, Enrique. His voice was calm, but there was a low, almost imperceptible tone that conveyed a tension I could not identify. I didn't think much of it at the time, as we were used to receiving all kinds of people. I handed him the key to the room he requested, one of the farthest from the entrance, and watched him walk down the hall. The night progressed, and the place began to get empty. By 10 p.m., most of the guests had already retired to their rooms, and quiet filled the hallways. It was then that something strange began to happen. At 11 p.m., Enrique appeared again at the reception desk. I didn't see him enter. I only heard him, his slow, calculated steps approaching. This time, he wasn't coming to check in like the first time. He approached the counter, looked around with a distant expression, as if he was looking for something other than attention. The first thing I noticed was that his clothes were more wrinkled than I remembered, and his eyes looked more tired, but at the same time more intense. He was silent for a few seconds, watching me without saying anything. The air became thick, as if a palpable tension was building up between the two of us. At that moment I felt strange, as if something in the atmosphere had changed, but I couldn't identify what. The sensation made me uncomfortable, but I tried to go about my business to show no sign of nervousness. He seemed determined to make me uncomfortable, and I didn't understand why. He asked me about the surroundings of the hotel, if there were interesting places to visit, but that was not what made me uneasy. It was his way of asking, his gaze fixed on me, as if he was looking for something in my answers. What disturbed me most was his insistence. Every answer I gave him, he seemed not to hear it completely, but rather to filter it, as if he had a deeper intention behind each word. I sensed that he was not just looking for information about the place, but something more, something I could not explain to myself. When I offered him information about the area, Enrique was disinterested, but his eyes never stopped watching me, fixed as if he was evaluating every word I said. At first I thought he was just a bored man or looking for a conversation, but I quickly realized I was wrong. The next day, returning from my break, I saw him again. This time, Enrique's behavior was even stranger. He was standing in front of his bedroom door, looking out into the hallway without moving a muscle. He did not react to my greeting, nor to the lights coming on in the morning. He was as if paralyzed, motionless, but his face had a tense expression, as if he was listening to something that only he could hear. At first, I tried to ignore him, but my discomfort grew with each passing minute. Enrique was starting to make me uneasy in a way I couldn't understand. I decided to do something I had never done before. I checked his booking record. I needed to understand what made him so different. To my surprise, there was nothing in the records to tell me that anything was out of the ordinary, except for one small detail. The phone number he had left for contact was a fake. It was not a local area number. I tried to look it up, but found nothing that matched. The afternoon of the third day was when something really happened that I couldn't ignore. I was working at the front desk when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a strange noise, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I didn't think it was anything important, but the sound intensified, and my curiosity compelled me to get up and go outside to see what was going on. As I walked down the hallway, I saw Enrique again. He was standing in front of one of the first-floor rooms, but this time, his behavior was more erratic. Suddenly, he looked up at me, but his eyes no longer reflected that calmness of before. They were empty, as if something inside him had broken. He approached me slowly, and his voice, now low and gravelly, told me that there was something about this hotel that was not normal. His tone of voice was louder, almost imperceptible, as if he was talking to himself. His presence enveloped me with an energy that chilled my skin. What happened next happened in the blink of an eye. Enrique approached me with unexpected speed and whispered something in my ear, something I didn't fully understand, but could never forget. "No one is leaving here. No one." His voice echoed in my ears long after he walked away, returning to his room with the same slow, calculated walk. That night, the hotel seemed even gloomier. The lights flickered brightly, and a strange chill ran through the hallways, as if the air had become thick and heavy. I couldn't stop thinking about what Enrique had told me. Nobody leaves here. The words echoed in my head, like a persistent echo that never stopped resounding. At dawn, as I prepared to leave, I realized that Enrique's room was empty. His luggage was gone, and there was no trace of him anywhere. My heart began to pound. I began to check the hotel's security cameras. On the monitors, I saw him. Enrique leaving his room in the wee hours of the morning, walking through the empty corridors of the hotel. No one accompanied him, and his figure slowly faded toward the exit. The strange thing is that no checkout was ever recorded at the front desk. No one had seen his departure. No car had left the parking lot. Enrique never left the hotel, or at least not in the way I had believed. Over the next few weeks, I tried to find out more about him, but I could never find anything about his whereabouts. No one knew who he was or what had led him to our hotel. My search had no answers, and the feeling of having been involved in something I did not understand never left me. Even today, years after that experience, I still work at the same place. But every time I see a strange client, someone who has that empty look, that unsettling calm, I can't help but remember Enrique's words. Nobody leaves here. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if he is still among us. If his shadow is still lurking, waiting for someone else to cross his path. My name is Esteban, and what happened that night is still marked in my mind, like a scar that never heals. I never imagined that something as simple as a phone call could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. Now looking back with my head full of haunting memories, I realize that night was the beginning of something much darker than I could have ever imagined. It all started on a Thursday, just like any other. I arrived home after a busy day at work. The rain was falling steadily, and the sound of the water hitting the windows gave me a momentary sense of calm. The traffic had been horrendous, and although I'm not one to let stress get the best of me, that day had been especially exhausting. Along the drive back, I thought I'd relax with some music, prepare a light dinner, and go to sleep early. Little did I know that something or someone was going to interrupt my routine that night. It was close to 11 p.m. when I heard the phone ring. I stopped dead in my tracks. I wasn't expecting any calls at that hour, much less from someone I knew. I lived alone and was not in the habit of receiving calls outside of regular hours. The ringing of the phone was persistent, and although my instinct told me I should let it ring, something compelled me to pick up the receiver. At first, I only heard breathing. It was heavy, as if someone was right on the other end, waiting for me to speak. The sound puzzled me, for there were no words, no recognizable sound, just breathing. I wanted to hang up, but before I did, a word appeared, distorted, choppy, almost inaudible, but still clear. Esteban. It was the only thing I heard. The voice was raspy, deep, but not at all familiar. I held the receiver tighter and asked who was on the other end, but the call cut off without warning. I looked at the phone screen, and to my surprise, there was no number registered. I stood there, motionless, with the phone in my hand. The feeling of discomfort began to creep into me. Who had called me? How did they know my name? At that moment, I felt a strange pressure in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about that breath, that deep, close sound. I decided to try to go on with my night as if nothing had happened. But something inside me told me that this call was not trivial. I tried to forget about it, but my mind wouldn't leave me alone. I decided to do something simple, like watching a program on TV, hoping it would distract me. But the calm I had sought seemed to have vanished, replaced by a growing sense of unease. No more than 30 minutes passed when the phone rang again. This time, the call was much quicker, almost urgent. I stood up, heart racing, and picked up the receiver with trembling hands. At first, the same thing, heavy breathing, as if someone was deliberately keeping me waiting. Suddenly, the raspy voice appeared again, this time more clearly, though the threat still hung in the air. "We know what you did." The words were barely a whisper, but I felt as if they pierced through me, as if they were uncovering a secret I didn't even know I had. Before I could react, the call cut out again. This time, I couldn't stay silent. I looked at the phone screen, but there was still no number. Only the sound of silence filled the room. Something didn't fit. What did that mean? "We know what you did." Those words echoed in my head, like a constant echo. I felt watched, but who would want to do that to me? I had no enemies, I was not a troubled person, nor had I done anything out of the ordinary. My life was quiet, monotonous, and up to that point, it was what I liked. The rest of the night passed slowly, but the anxiety did not fade. I had let myself be carried away by that feeling of dread that I didn't know how to handle. The call had been strange, but the second one had been even more disconcerting. What made me uneasy was that I felt there was something else, something behind all this that I could not understand. I decided to sleep, although the feeling of discomfort would not leave me alone. I turned off the lights, got into bed, and tried to disconnect my mind. But before I fell asleep, the phone rang once again. My pulse quickened, and a bead of sweat ran down my forehead. This time I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone quickly, but as I picked it up, I realized something terrifying. There was no sound on the other end. There was only the empty line, the dull thud of silence. But I felt it. I knew it. I was being watched. A few seconds later, the breathing returned, that breathing I couldn't ignore. My heart began to beat wildly. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding or a joke. There was something deeply disturbing about the way this being, this presence, was stalking me. The breathing became more intense, as if it was getting closer and closer. Suddenly, a strange sound began to filter down the line. It was like a crackle, a frightening noise, almost indescribable. At that moment, the phone began to emit a dull thud, as if it was about to break. I couldn't take it anymore. I hung up, and for a few seconds, I held the receiver in my hand, trembling. I looked around, but there was nothing. The room was just as quiet as before, but I no longer felt safe. Days went by, and the calls didn't stop. At first, I was told that I should ignore them, that it was a joke, that maybe someone was playing a trick on me. But I knew it wasn't a joke. The calls intensified, and even though I tried to change my number, they kept calling me, always at the same times, always with the same dreadful breathing at first, and then those disturbing messages. It was no longer just a simple intrusion. It was a persecution, something much darker. One afternoon, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I contacted the police, although I knew it wouldn't be easy. I explained what was going on, but they couldn't do much without proof. It was as if my words carried no weight. They just told me that if the calls continued, I should report them again, but that there was nothing more they could do without a clear trail. Shortly thereafter, something even more disturbing happened. One morning, upon opening my mailbox, I found a letter. There was no return address, just my name written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside, there was a single line written, "We are watching you. Never forget what you did." My skin bristled as I read those words. Terror swept over me, but I didn't know what to do with that information. What did that mean? What did it have to do with the calls? What did anyone know about me? The calls in the letter weren't the worst. The worst came later. Doors closing on their own, lights flickering for no reason, an unexplained sound coming from the walls of my apartment. I could no longer ignore that something bigger than me was happening. I could not see the stalker's face, nor understand his intentions, but I felt that he was getting closer and closer, as if everything was leading to a revelation, one I didn't want to know. I still don't know who was behind those calls. I never knew what I did to deserve such anguish, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The rain still falls every time I remember those nights, and even though I no longer hear the breathing on the other end of the line, I know that the fear is more real than I ever imagined. My name is Samuel, and what I'm about to tell you is not something I like to remember, but after all this time, I feel it's time to let it out. People, those who still worry about my absence, don't understand why I disappeared, let alone the reasons that led me to make that decision. They are not looking for answers because they are afraid of what they might find. It is not easy to talk about betrayal, especially when it comes from the people you love the most. But sometimes the pain is so great that there is no turning back. It all started in a small town, a community that I thought I knew every nook and cranny. I lived there all my life, surrounded by my family and friends. I had a decent job as a technician in an appliance store. I didn't complain about my life, but there was always something inside me that told me there was something more, something I hadn't yet discovered. But through it all, I was calm, at peace with what I had. Things changed in a way I never imagined. It was a normal autumn day. Cool air was filtering through the windows of the house, and I was sitting at the kitchen table sipping my coffee. My sister Laura approached me with a strange look on her face, as if she had something to say to me but couldn't bring herself to say it. I knew something was wrong. She had always been someone I trusted, my confidant, my friend. I didn't understand why she seemed distant lately. Suddenly, my father came into the room. He was pale, as if he had seen a ghost. No one said anything for a couple of minutes until Laura broke the silence. "Samuel, there's something you need to know." What happened next changed me completely. That day, my life was no longer the same. My parents, with their guilty looks, told me something I never imagined. Not only were there hidden secrets about our family, but those secrets involved me directly. I discovered that my mother was not who I thought she was, that my father had hidden terrifying truths about our history, and worst of all, my sister had been involved in a series of lies that had surrounded me my entire life. It was as if my world came crashing down on me in a matter of seconds. How was it possible that I hadn't noticed anything before? How could I have been so naive not to realize that my entire existence had been built on a lie? The worst part was that it wasn't just an innocent lie. It was a profound betrayal. Something I could not forgive. My sister Laura had been part of a plan that involved manipulation, deception, and a desire to destroy my life, to make me feel small and worthless. I learned that for years my parents had been managing my decisions, making me believe that I made my own choices, when in reality, it had all been carefully orchestrated. But what hurt me the most was learning that Laura, my sister, had been the key player in all of that. Worst of all, I could no longer trust anyone. My mother, my father, my sister, everyone was involved. My life had been a lie that had finally come to an end. Anger, helplessness, sadness, all mixed in my chest until I didn't know what to do. Anger blinded me, and I felt that the only way to escape from it all was to leave it behind. If I couldn't trust my own family, what was the point of staying? I made the decision to leave. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't even say goodbye. The need to escape that environment was eating me up inside. I didn't want them to find me. I didn't want them to know where I was. I felt that my previous life had died at that moment, and the only way to be reborn was to disappear. I was ready to start again, but somewhere else, far away from those who had betrayed me. The night before I left, the rain was coming down hard on the roof of the house. In my room, I packed the essentials, some clothes, money, and my old backpack. I didn't want to leave any clues. I wasn't going back, and even though I knew my parents would be looking for me, I felt freer than ever. As I walked through the empty streets of town, the sound of the storm seemed to absorb all my thoughts. There was no turning back. For the first few days, my mind was so clouded with grief and anger that I couldn't think of anything else. I drove for hours aimlessly, stopping only to rest, to grab a quick bite to eat and continue my journey. The road seemed endless, and I could think of only one thing: escape. I didn't want anyone to find me. I didn't want to hear their apologies or see their remorseful faces. They didn't deserve my forgiveness, and if I ever decided to return, it would be to show them that it was all over. It was weeks before I felt even the slightest bit safe. At first, I was lost in the immensity of what I had done. I didn't know exactly where I had gone, but I was far from everything I knew. I lived in cheap motels, slept on park benches, and learned to stay hidden. I changed cities several times, but I couldn't escape the feeling of guilt that haunted me. But what terrified me most was the possibility that they would find me. My parents, with the help of close friends and acquaintances, began to look for me. They didn't understand why I had disappeared or why I had left them without explanation. The calls and messages started coming in, but I never answered them. Every time I saw an unknown number on my phone, I shuddered. I knew they were desperately searching, but I didn't care. I had stopped being a part of their lives, and worst of all, I no longer felt any obligation to return. Over the months, the calls became more frequent, more insistent. Sometimes I would receive messages from Laura asking for forgiveness and begging me to come home. She would tell me that nothing I had done had been personal, that it was all part of a plan that she couldn't stop. I knew those words were empty, but still they hurt me. I couldn't forgive what she had done. She had used me as a pawn in a game I had no control over, and I couldn't overlook that. Eventually, the loneliness began to weigh on me. The days became endless, and the emptiness I felt was so deep that not even distance seemed to be enough to fill it. I began to question whether I had really done the right thing by leaving. But every time I thought about going back, the image of my family, their faces of betrayal, stopped me. I knew that if I went back, everything would be the same, that the lies would continue, that they would continue to control everything around them, and I couldn't bear it. The freedom I felt when I left was the only one that was really worth it. Even today, many years after I made that decision, I am still a lost man. I have never heard from my family again, and they, despite everything, are still trying to find me. But I have learned to live with the disappearance. I am a shadow, a specter in a world I no longer recognize. I don't know if I will ever come back or if regret will make me change my mind. What I do know is that I am no longer the same person I once was, and that what happened between us was something that has no way back. The sacrifice was necessary so that I could live on my own terms. I am Samuel, and I have no intention of going back. My name is Joseph, and what happened to me a couple of years ago changed my life in such a profound way that I never thought I could become part of a story like this. I never considered myself a particularly brave person, much less a heroic one. In fact, I had always preferred to stay out of any conflictual situation. But what happened that night in that dark alley made me realize what we are really capable of doing when faced with fear. It was a rainy night, something so common at that time of year. I left work late, as was almost always the case. The streets were empty. The few who ventured to walk in the rain did so quickly, with their jackets pulled over their heads, trying to protect themselves from the cold drops. The city at that instant seemed immersed in a silence rarely experienced in such crowded places. I had to walk to the bus stop, and the road took me through a rather dark stretch, away from the main lights of the city. It wasn't the kind of place where someone would expect to run into trouble. However, that night was different. As I walked, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I didn't think too much about it, as the rain and the echo of my own footsteps on the pavement made me feel a strange sense of insecurity. But what made me turn around was the shadow that crossed in front of me. It was a man of medium build, dressed in a dark jacket. At first, I didn't see him clearly, as the rain and the gloom prevented me from making out the details. But what struck me as strange was the fact that after crossing in front of me, the man did not continue walking but stopped, as if he was waiting for something. I felt the need to pick up the pace, and I did so without thinking too much. I didn't want to get involved in anything. I didn't want to be near anyone who might be looking for trouble. I kept walking briskly, but then I heard the sound of a scream, a piercing scream that made me stop in my tracks. It was brief, just a few seconds, but long enough to make my heart race. At first, I thought it might have been an accident or maybe someone screaming from the cold, from the storm. But then, I heard it again. This time much closer. A few steps behind me, I turned and saw a figure appear out of the shadows. It was the same man, and in his hands he was holding something. At first, I didn't know what it was. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, and my mind, confused by the storm, tried to make sense of what I was seeing. But at that moment, everything became clear. The man had committed a crime. What he held in his hands was nothing but a knife covered in blood, still dripping despite the rain. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know whether to run, whether to scream, whether to call for help. My body was completely paralyzed, and fear gripped me in a way I had never experienced before. The man looked at me with a coldness that chilled me. He didn't say a word, but his gaze said it all. There was no compassion, no regret, just a kind of absolute emptiness. At that moment, I realized that I was not in front of someone who had made a mistake or made a mistake in a moment of anger. I was in front of someone who had planned what I had just done, someone who would not hesitate to follow through if he felt it necessary. The scene in front of me stretched on like an eternity, and my mind was completely trapped in that space of absolute fear. The sound of the rain covered everything, but even with the water hitting the asphalt, the only thing I could hear was my breathing, which had become heavier with each passing second. Somehow I realized that the man had no intention of killing me, at least not at that moment. He didn't see me as a threat, but what he did know was that he had witnessed something horrible, something that connected him to a crime he could not escape. With a sharp gesture, the man started walking in the opposite direction, away from me. My heart was still pounding and the feeling of dread was still in the air even after he disappeared into the shadows. I couldn't move. I couldn't process what I had just witnessed. I didn't know if I should keep walking, if I should call the police, if I should tell someone what I had seen. But what I did know was that something inside me was telling me that if I did, my life would change forever. Paranoia gripped me for days. The fear that the man would return, that he would find me and decide that I could not be a witness, haunted me on every corner, on every street I walked down. I thought about the consequences of having been the only witness to the crime, and the constant question in my head was the same. What would I do if the man came back for me? I could not sleep for several days. Every noise, every shadow seemed like a threat. I tried to go on with my life, but anxiety consumed me little by little. Somehow, I felt that something was watching me, that someone was watching me at all times. The walls of my house, once familiar and reassuring, now felt strange to me, as if I was no longer alone there. Fear had infiltrated my life like a disease I could not cure. But time passed, and life went on. No one around me knew what had happened that night. I could not tell anyone what I had seen. I could not be a witness to a crime without endangering my own life. I convinced myself that it was best to forget what I had witnessed, that the police would not find anything if they investigated, and that maybe, just maybe, that man was already gone from my life forever. That feeling of fear never completely went away. I knew that something dark had happened, that I was involved in something much bigger than I imagined. At some point, I realized that I was no longer just a witness. Somehow I had been marked, and the price of keeping silent was much higher than I had thought. Today, I still find myself looking over my shoulder. The memories of that night have not faded, and though I have tried to move on, the weight of what I saw and what I chose not to say will never leave me alone. I continue to live with the anguish of having hidden the truth, with the fear that someday he may come back to find me, with the awareness that in the end, we are all witnesses and accomplices to something, even if we choose not to intervene. My name is Andres. People who know me today probably could not imagine where I come from. I lead a quiet life with a stable job and a small family that is my refuge. But what many people don't know is that during the first years of my life, I lived in a constant nightmare, one that left marks in my mind and soul that I am still trying to erase. I grew up in a small town, a place where everyone seemed to know each other, but where closed doors hid dark secrets. My family was one of those that from the outside seemed normal. My mother, Carolina, was a sweet woman, always willing to help others. My father, Rogelio, was the man the townspeople respected, or at least pretended to respect. He was a strong man, with an intimidating character that no one dared to challenge. But inside our house, the reality was completely different. My father was not the kind man others thought they saw. In private, he was a violent, controlling, and angry man. I can't remember a single week when he didn't blow up over something petty. It could be the plate that was out of place, the TV being too loud, or simply my mother breathing near him at the wrong time. For me, as a child, it was impossible to understand why my father behaved the way he did. All I knew was that we had to tread carefully, always alert, trying not to unleash his fury. But even when we tried, he always seemed to find an excuse to explode. One night when I was 8 years old, something changed in my perception of fear. It was winter and the wind was blowing hard against the windows. My mother had prepared dinner, a simple stew that she said was the only thing she had been able to cook with the few remaining ingredients. My father arrived late with the smell of alcohol permeating his clothes. From the moment he walked through the door, his expression told me something was wrong. I don't know what exactly it was that set him off that night. Maybe the fact that the dinner wasn't to his liking, or maybe he just needed a reason to vent his anger. The only thing I remember clearly is the sound of the dishes crashing to the floor and the screams of my mother asking him to calm down. I was hiding behind the sofa, trembling, wishing I was invisible. That time, his fury didn't stop at screaming. It was the first time I saw him hit my mother. The scene stuck in my memory like a movie I can't turn off. His hands, large and calloused, closed around her arm as he shook her as if she were a rag doll. She tried to protect herself, but he was stronger. The sound of the blows echoed through the house, mingling with her sobs. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything. It was as if my body had decided to shut down to protect me from the horror I was witnessing. After that night, something changed in my mother. She became quieter, more cautious. She had always been a strong woman, but now she seemed to be walking on broken glass, trying not to make noise. I changed too. I became more reserved, more fearful. Every time my father raised his voice, my heart would race, fearing the worst. Over time, things only got worse. My father not only directed his anger at my mother, he also began to turn it on me. I remember one afternoon when he chastised me for breaking a glass. It wasn't an accident, according to him. It was disrespectful, proof that I wasn't afraid of him. He beat me with the belt until I lost count of the spankings, and then he locked me in my room, telling me I didn't deserve to be in his house. Those moments of confinement were, ironically, a relief. At least there I was, away from him, from his look of contempt, from his screams that filled every corner of the house. But the loneliness was also terrifying. I would spend hours sitting in the dark, listening to the noises in the house, wondering if that night would be the last I would spend there. One day, something happened that marked a turning point in my life. My mother and I were home alone, one of the few times we had a respite from her presence. She took me into the kitchen and told me, her voice trembling, that we should escape. She told me of a plan to leave while he was at work, to seek refuge at the home of an aunt who lived in another town. At first, the idea filled me with hope. Could it be possible to leave all that behind? Could we find a place where we wouldn't have to live in fear? But that hope quickly turned to panic. I knew what my father was capable of. If he found out we had tried to run away, there would be no place in the world where we could hide. The day of the escape came, and my mother woke me early. We gathered our things quietly, trying not to make a sound. But just as we were about to leave, we heard the sound of the front door opening. My father had returned earlier than expected. His gaze fell on the suitcases by the door, and his expression transformed into a mixture of fury and betrayal. I don't remember exactly what happened next. It's all a blur of screams, struggles, and tears. All I know is that we didn't escape that night. My mother ended up with bruises on her arms, and I, with a broken soul. From that moment on, my father's vigilance intensified. He would not let us leave the house without his permission, and every time we mentioned someone from the outside, he looked at us with suspicion. It was years before we managed to escape. It was an act of desperation, one early morning when he had drunk so much that he fell fast asleep. My mother and I left with what little we could carry without looking back. I don't know how we did it, but we made it to my aunt's house, who took us in with no questions asked. Today, my father is just a memory, one I try to keep at bay. I never heard from him again, and I have no intention of looking for him. But the scars he left on me are still there, invisible but deep. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I'm that little boy behind the couch again, trembling with fear, wishing it was all just a bad dream. And even though I know I'm safe now, there are nights when the past returns, reminding me that terror doesn't always need ghosts to exist. My name is Ricardo, and although I never considered myself weak, what I experienced 5 years ago changed forever the way I perceive my own strength. If I can tell it today, it is because I survived. But every day I wonder if that experience left me more broken than alive. It all started with something as simple as an ad in college, one of those signs you see in passing and barely register. It promised a good amount of money for participating in a psychological study. At the time, I was young, I had few responsibilities, and above all, I needed the money. I never imagined that this would become my worst nightmare. The advertisement bore the logo of a prestigious university, something that gave me confidence. There was a contact number and a brief description mentioning the analysis of human behavior under pressure. I found it intriguing. As an engineering student, I didn't know much about psychology, but I had always been curious to understand how the mind worked. I called the number, and after a few basic questions was summoned to a nondescript-looking building on the outskirts of town. I clearly remembered the day I arrived. It was a gray, inconspicuous building, surrounded by a small parking lot and trees that seemed to have been planted without much care. At the reception desk, I was greeted by a young woman with a mechanical smile and a white apron. She asked me to sign some papers, a statement of consent and a confidentiality agreement. I didn't read too much. The fine print seemed irrelevant. If there was one thing I knew at 22, it was that no one reads those contracts, and no one seems to regret it. At least I thought not. After signing, I was ushered into a room where the purpose of the experiment was explained to me. It was designed, they said, to measure the psychological and emotional resilience of participants under controlled stress conditions. They talked about bright lights, loud sounds, but assured me that everything was supervised by experts. It sounded uncomfortable to me, but not dangerous. I would not be the only participant. When I arrived, I had seen other people in the hallway, all with the same curious and slightly nervous expression. I never imagined I would never see any of them again after that day. I was taken to a small room, barely furnished with a chair and a metal table. The walls were completely white with no windows. Everything seemed minimalist, almost clinical, as if the space itself was designed to be uncomfortable. I was asked to sit down and was fitted with a bracelet that measured my heart rate. In one corner of the room, a camera was pointed at me. Everything will be recorded for analysis purposes, they said. That didn't alarm me. It seemed standard for such an experiment. The first few hours were strange but manageable. They had me perform simple tasks, such as solving puzzles on a tablet or remembering sequences of numbers while annoying noises interrupted my concentration. Then, without warning, they turned off the lights. The darkness was absolute, and for a moment, the silence was so oppressive that I could almost hear my own breathing echoing in the room. Then it began. First, there were sounds. A high-pitched ringing like a train pulling into the station repeated over and over, mixed with childish laughter that seemed to come from a defective toy. Then a male voice began to speak through a loudspeaker. I didn't recognize the language, but the tone was urgent, almost aggressive. My heart raced, and I could see on the screen of my bracelet how my heart rate was rising rapidly. Every time I tried to ignore the noises and concentrate on my breathing, something new would burst in. An alarm, a knock, the sound of breaking glass. Hours passed, or so I thought. It was hard to measure time without lights or clocks. When the lights came on, the woman who had greeted me at the entrance came in with a glass of water and a reassuring smile. She told me she was doing a great job, that there were only a couple more tests left. But when I tried to ask her questions, like how long she had been there or when she would be finished, she avoided answering. His attitude, so polished and friendly at first, was beginning to seem more robotic than human to me. The next phase was worse. I was taken to a larger room where there was a metal cage in the center. Inside there was a worn and dirty mannequin, dressed in hospital clothes. I was told that I was to spend time in that room while they observed my reaction. I didn't understand the purpose, but what really puzzled me was that, although I knew it was a mannequin, its position changed every time I looked away. First it was sitting, then it seemed to lean toward the door. I began to doubt my perception. Was it them moving it to play with my mind? Or was I beginning to lose my sanity? At some point I lost track of how many days had passed. I was not allowed to leave, and my interactions with those in charge were minimal. Every time I tried to talk, I was asked to concentrate on the tests. I began to feel like a lab mouse. I could no longer distinguish between the tests and reality. How much of what I was experiencing was a psychological game? Was anyone else in the building? Was I constantly being watched? The cameras, the microphones, even the mirrors in the rooms, everything seemed threatening to me. The breaking point came during the last test. I was taken to an empty room with a table and a chair, where there was a sealed envelope. I was told to read the instructions and follow them to the letter. When I opened the envelope, I found a photograph of me clearly taken during the experiment, but what alarmed me was that it was crossed out in red ink. Underneath, there was a list of phone numbers, including my mother's. The note simply read, "If you fail, someone will pay for it." The terror was immediate. I felt a knot in my stomach as I tried to figure out if this was a real threat or just another manipulation. My mind was so fragmented that I could no longer discern between truth and lies. What I did know was that I couldn't take any chances. I wanted to get out, to end it. but I felt that any wrong decision would endanger not only my life, but also the lives of the people I loved. When I left that place, I did not leave as the same Ricardo who had entered. I was told that the experiment was over, that I had been an exceptional participant, and I was handed an envelope with the promised money. They never explained to me the real purpose of what they had done, and when I tried to look for answers later, I discovered that the building had been abandoned. The number I originally called was no longer in service, and no one seemed to have any record of the alleged experiment. Since then, I live with a latent fear, a constant paranoia. Sometimes I have the feeling that I am still being watched. When I see cameras in public places, I wonder if they are connected to the same people who manipulated my mind and body during those days. I have tried to rebuild my life, but there is always a part of me that is still trapped in that gray building, reliving every moment. I don't know if I will ever know the full truth, but what I learned is that the worst horror is not the one you see in the movies, but the one born from losing control over your own life. What was done to me left no visible scars, but it broke me in ways I can't even describe. Now, every time I pass in front of a nondescript building, I feel that a part of me is frozen, as if that experiment was not completely over. The story I am about to tell does not have a happy ending, or rather, it has no ending. No clear closure to put it behind us. And the worst of all is that I know it. I am still trapped in it, even though the shadows of the past no longer haunt me physically. But the mind, that treacherous one, gives me no respite. My name is Martin Gonzalez, and I have always been an ordinary man, an office man who prefers stability to adventure. My life, before what I am about to tell you, was simple. A routine of work, home, work, home. That all changed when a co-worker, who we'll call Javier, convinced me to join a special project he was involved in. Javier had always been a mysterious guy, someone who knew how to make others feel attracted to his ideas. That project seemed to be a unique opportunity to get a promotion and perhaps something more. The project was secret. They didn't tell us exactly what it was about, only that it was related to high-level research. He said that everything was confidential, that no one could talk to anyone, and that if I had any doubts, I should leave them at the door. At that moment, I was drawn into the mystery. The idea of being involved in something important made me feel useful, even special. At first, the tasks were simple. A few interviews, surveys, and data collection. As time went on, the intensity increased, but with it, the rewards increased. The money on offer was tempting. Finally, after weeks of work, we were summoned to a meeting at a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. The place was an old farmhouse I had never seen before. It was remote, surrounded by trees, and looked like an abandoned place. We gathered in the main living room. There were a few other people in the room, all with the same look of curiosity as me. It was hard to understand what we were doing there, but again, the promise of something big kept us all expectant. The meeting began with vague explanations with no specifics. There was talk of risks, of significant changes, of moving toward a new paradigm. But as time went on, everything started to get darker, more confusing. Something didn't fit. Javier seemed nervous, and that was something he was not used to showing. I didn't fully understand what happened in that place, but what I do know is that, as we left, each of us began to change in some way. I felt it immediately. It was not a physical transformation, not a sickness. It was something more subtle, something that was going around inside me and telling me that something wasn't right. The next few weeks were a spiral of paranoia and fear. I couldn't stop thinking about the meeting. Something about what had happened there I couldn't get out of my head. No one else seemed to talk about it, but I knew we were all aware that something was wrong. I began to watch the others, looking for signs that they felt the same way. Javier, the man who had introduced us to all this, was also different. He was becoming more erratic, his countenance pale and worried. He had lost the sparkle in his eyes, as if the very essence of life had left him. I remember one night in particular. I was in my apartment alone when I received a call from Javier. He said he needed to see me urgently. At that hour, I no longer trusted his words, but there was something in his tone that made me feel I could not ignore him. I decided to go. The meeting was at the same place, the country house, but this time there was no light in the windows, as if everything had been turned off, as if the place was dead. When I entered, I found Javier in the same room where we had met the first time. He was sitting in a chair, his face completely unfocused, staring at something in his hands. He didn't say anything to me at first, just watched me. And then finally, he spoke. He told me that the others were gone, that the others had left, that they no longer wanted to know anything about what we had done. Something in his tone chilled my blood. What followed were confused, incomplete words. But I understood. The project had failed, or so they thought. But in reality, there was something else, something worse, that they could not control. I stood there with him for hours, listening, trying to understand what had happened. The feeling that I was being pulled into something bigger, darker, grew inside me. Something was not right. This was not just a simple experiment or project. There was something else behind it, something hidden. The next thing I remember, as I tried to get out, I saw something through the window. A shadow, moving quickly, crossing the garden. The figure disappeared before I could react. But the feeling of being watched, of being in danger, came over me. I turned to ask Javier, but he was no longer there. The chair was empty. I felt something tighten in my chest, as if the air had become thicker. I left the house quickly, my heart racing, and when I looked back, I saw nothing. The place was completely silent. What happened next was even more disconcerting. When I returned to my apartment, I found my phone full of unread messages, all from Javier. But the strangest was the last message, the one that came long after I left the house. It said, "There's no turning back now. They know what we did. They are watching." I couldn't sleep that night. The feeling that something horrible was about to happen kept me on edge. The next morning I tried to reach Javier, but his phone was off. I went to the office, but no one seemed to have heard from him. No one mentioned anything about the project or the meeting. Everything had disappeared. Weeks passed, but the fear did not go away. I didn't know if I was still being watched or if I had imagined it all, but I began to feel like something was following me. I wasn't sure what had really happened in that house. Was it part of an experiment or something much more sinister? Was Javier involved in something dangerous that I didn't understand? To this day, I am still looking for answers. No one talks about that project or the house. And Javier disappeared without a trace. Every time I pass through the city, my mind wonders if I will ever know what happened, or if the answer is hidden in some dark corner that I will never find. There is no proof, no evidence, just an unsettling feeling that something is still there, lurking, waiting. And I still can't stop thinking about it. The worst part is that I don't know if I'll ever know. Maybe the mystery is so deep that I'll never get the answer. And that, perhaps, is the scariest part of it all. The night was dark and the rain was falling hard on the asphalt, hitting the windshield of my truck with an insistence that seemed to want to break through the glass. My name is Hugo Morales, and I have been working for years as a cargo truck driver. I have traveled every corner of the country, sometimes with the sun shining on my face, other times under the endless shadow of the night. But that night was different. Something happened that changed my perception of everything I thought I knew about the road. It was a long shift, and I was heading south, hauling a load of construction materials. The road was empty, and the sound of the truck's wheels on the wet asphalt was the only thing to be heard, except for the roar of the engine that kept going, unstoppable, like a beast in search of its destination. It wasn't the first time I had driven in heavy rain, but this time something seemed out of place. The air was thick, almost heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on that road. At first, I tried to ignore the discomfort that haunted me. The radio was turned off as usual, so as not to distract me, and the only sound that accompanied me was the pattering of the rain. As I drove on, the lights of my truck intermittently illuminated the road, creating shadows that danced along the edges of the road. That's when I saw it, or at least I thought I did. In the distance, a man was standing at the edge of the road in the rain. He was completely soaked and seemed to be staring off into the horizon, motionless, as if he didn't care about the cold or the storm. I couldn't see his face clearly, but something about his posture made me uncomfortable. The road was deserted, and in that stretch there was no town nearby, which made his presence even stranger. I thought about slowing down and asking him if he needed help, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fact that there were no signs of life around. Maybe it was the way the figure didn't move at all, even as I approached. I walked past it, paying no attention to it. I had no time to waste, and besides, something told me I shouldn't stop. The weather seemed to become even thicker, as if the air had become thicker as I went along. The wind began to blow harder and the raindrops were becoming whips against the truck. Visibility decreased with every mile I drove. I held on to the steering wheel, focusing on the road, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Then something even stranger happened. The lights on my truck began to flicker, and for a moment I thought there was a problem with the electrical system. I tried to ignore it, but the light on the road seemed to fade, as if I was caught in a thick fog. The feeling that something or someone was following me intensified. I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. In the distance, the figure I had seen before was still there, and now it seemed to be moving. Its silhouette was moving along the edge of the road just as before, unchanging and silent. Something about his movement was unsettling, as if he was in no hurry, as if he knew I couldn't escape that feeling of pressure building up on me. I tried to speed up to get away, but for some reason the truck did not respond immediately. It was as if time dragged on and the road became endless. My breathing became more agitated as I saw the figure getting closer and closer. I couldn't understand what was happening. I was trapped in a nightmare that was slowly unfolding with no escape, as if the road itself was leading me to something I could not comprehend. The sound of wheels on wet asphalt seemed like a distant echo, and all that remained was that man, walking in the rain. When the figure was close enough for me to make out the details, fear paralyzed me. This was no ordinary man. His face was completely covered by a mask, a stiff, white, expressionless face. I could not see his eyes nor his mouth. He was a faceless figure. The sight gave me a deep shiver, one of those that run through your body like an icy current. Suddenly, the truck began to turn. It wasn't something I did, but the steering wheel turned on its own, as if something was manipulating it. The truck skidded across the wet road, and I felt myself losing control. My heart pounded, sweat covered my forehead, and fear clouded my mind. I tried to maintain control, but the steering no longer responded to my movements. Somehow I managed to stop the truck, which was slightly tilted over the edge of the road. My breathing was quickening and my mind was full of jumbled thoughts. What was going on? Who was that figure? How was it possible that the road, which I had once known like the back of my hand, had become so terrifying? I hurried out of the truck, seeking to get some fresh air, to try to clear my thoughts. The rain was still falling relentlessly, and the sound of the water was the only thing that dominated. As I looked around, the figure was no longer there. The roadside was empty. There was no trace of anything, as if it had never been there in the first place. But as I stood there, staring into the emptiness, I felt something strange in the air, the feeling that I was not alone, that someone or something was watching me from the darkness. I didn't know how, but I knew that the figure had not disappeared. The feeling of being stalked came over me, and although I couldn't see anything, fear clutched at my chest. Gradually, the wind ceased and the rain began to diminish until there were only a few scattered drops falling to the ground. The sound of my truck's engine, which had stopped running for a moment, returned to normal, and the road was deathly quiet. I decided it was time to move on. I couldn't just stand there staring at nothing. I started the truck, and although the feeling of being chased tormented me, I kept going, without looking back. The road in front of me was still endless, and the shadows of the night seemed to come alive with every step I took. When I finally reached my destination, I felt exhausted, as if I had been trapped in a dream from which I could not wake up. Today, though I try to forget what happened that night, I still feel that faceless figure following me, that it has not disappeared. And when I drive again, I can no longer avoid looking in the rearview mirror, hoping that it will never appear again. But the truth is that I know that the road has a way of returning what you leave behind, and sometimes the shadows of the inexplicable never completely vanish.